I don't know if you see me there. All right, there's the thumbs up. Awesome. All right. Well, it's been a while since we've seen each other. We're in for a riveting performance from Martha, I'm sure, tonight on mining.
Riveting.
That's a high bar.
High bar.
All right. So, do we need to do a call to order and roll call as we usually do, or is it?
I think so.
So we will go through the standard. Do a quick roll call. If you're here, say aye. So the chair, Brian.
Here, what do you say?
Nay. The chair, Brian Pasco, is present. Mary Phillips, vice chair, is not present. Christine Drazen is on her way. Louise, whoops. Aye. Commissioner Murphy. Here we are. Commissioner Peterson.
Present.
Commissioner Schroedel is absent. Commissioner Stevens.
Here.
Commissioner Wilson.
Here.
There we go. Got through that formality. I don't believe I see anyone in the public so that we can dispense with the public comment, and we will move quickly into the study session with Glenn.
Sure.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Glenn Hamburg. I'm a planner with the Planning and Zoning Division. You might remember me from such adventures as marijuana license restrictions. Now I'm here with this item on the agenda, ZDO 276, fiscal year 2020 minor amendments. I'm just going to say a couple of short words about this project at the beginning. On the FY19 to FY21 long-range planning work program is a project titled Minor and Time-Sensitive ZDO Amendments. And this is a project that is intended to ensure that the ZDO keeps up with new and pending state and federal mandates that affect land use. It's also a project to clarify but not substantively change existing language and to correct certain errors that we've just seen along the way. Some of these errors are not necessarily anything egregious. Indeed, they might be things we're already doing, but just to keep up the language in the code to match what it is we might be implementing already with regard to state law, for example. And also this project is intended to adopt some optional provisions that the county may choose to go forward with because of new state legislation or because of rules that have already been on the books, provided that these optional provisions just require some minimal analysis, things that we might be able to make some small tweaks here and there. I might just add that on the work program, there's an intention to consider 3 specific issues in this package. One of them is dog daycare and boarding, or kennels as we know them, in rural residential areas. We'll talk about that. There's an intention to specifically consider minor amendments for addressing small-scale manufacturing in community commercial areas. And then there's an intention to look at increasing the notice radius in rural areas of certain land use applications. So these are 3 specific issues, and then there's a few others that staff are proposing to be considered in this package. And the vehicle for all of that, all of these mandates, all of these cleanups and efforts to address small issues nibbling at the margins will be done through this ordinance, ZDO 276. And it's our intention to have a first draft of actual proposed amendments sometime in February. And what we're hoping for here is some direction specifically on these optional provisions that we have before us, and then also to brief the Planning Commission on what some of the mandates are. And we've broken it down into a few sections, and I'm just going to jump right in. The first one is about these mandates. And maybe if it works best, I'll just say a few short words about each of them, and then I could take some questions if there are any about these mandates. So these are things that we must do. And it makes sense in these cases to amend text that is currently in the ZDO. And there are 8 of them that we're proposing to address in this ordinance. The first one is regarding forest template dwellings. These are dwellings that may be allowed in the ag, forest, and timber zones with a consideration of the number of lots of record and existing dwellings that actually existed within a defined space on January 1st of 1993. And there's been some recent state legislation, House Bill 2225, that address the rules for implementing forest template dwellings, or approving them rather. A couple of the mandates are things that we already do by practice with regard to how you define the center of this template that we spin around. Another one is how we consider property line adjustments. Those won't require any modifications to our existing rules in the ZDO. One substantive change that this House bill brought about is the lots that can be considered for new dwellings that at least right now or recently were part of a tract. So one or more contiguous lots of record under the same ownership. The state has tightened the rules under which somebody with multiple pieces of ag, forest, or timber zone property next to each other can be put into separate ownership and qualify for new dwellings. They've reined in those rules. Now, the wording in the House bill is a little unclear, and there's going to be some rulemaking on this bill, as there is for all of these, this month and next. And hopefully that rulemaking will clarify exactly what the rules for the county will be. So the wording that we actually change in the ZDO might change depending on what we find out from rulemaking. But there's this mandate that's going to change how we consider the number of dwellings with regard to template test. House Bill 2844 is a mandate related to small-scale farm processing. It requires the county to allow certain farm processing operations that are 2,500 square feet without regard to siting standards, is the term that they use. Siting standards is also kind of ambiguous. We don't know, does that mean, for example, setbacks that we apply to structures or not? But we'll find out more in rulemaking. But this is something that will have to allow this small-scale processing of farm crops when it's no more than 2,500 square feet. The state changed the rules for replacement dwellings in the EFU district. So right now it's the case that if a dwelling once existed but was removed from the property, maybe because it was destroyed by fire, the rules require that in order to be replaced in the EFU zone under the applicable regulations, that dwelling has to have been assessed at the dwelling at the time the, quote, value was removed, in a sense that it was assessed as a dwelling by the tax assessor when it burned down. The state rule on that has changed. It doesn't allow us to consider the tax status of the dwelling when it was removed. Number 4, the state changed the rules for allowing non-conforming secondary schools on farmland. Basically, they made it potentially easier for an existing secondary school to expand onto an adjacent farm property under certain limitations. So the ZDO already potentially allows for this, but this new state bill prohibits the county from considering things like the density of new buildings and the spacing of those buildings on the adjacent lot when we consider this idea of additional adverse impacts to the neighborhood. So it's a minor tweak, but it's something that would warrant some changes and clarifications to the ZDO. Number 5, ag, forest, and EFU farm breweries. So a farm brewery is defined in Senate Bill 287, and it is, in short, something that is for small-scale manufacturers of malt beverages. We're not talking large conglomerates, but something where the farm is about 15 acres in size, the hop farm, that is. And that particular brewery that is making beer, malt beverages from that 15 acres of hops is producing no more than 15,000 barrels of malt beverages per year from that particular 15 acres. And indeed, if this brewery has other sites of 15 acres elsewhere, its total of all these different sites of production cannot lead to more than 150,000 barrels. So these limitations are meant to allow small-scale brewing outright on farmland. And that's what it requires the county to do with certain siting standards. 100-foot setbacks, for example. This requirement is similar to existing allowances for wineries and cideries in the EFU zone, so it sort of just allows now breweries to do a similar thing. The bill also requires the county to provide an opportunity for the other commercial activities associated with the actual production of beer. For example, maybe tasting rooms or dinners that the brewery wants to sell to customers on site. That would require certain findings that the proposal has adequate circulation on the property, is far enough away from property lines, but we have to provide the opportunity to do this. Number 6, there was that major housing bill that came out of the legislature, well, a couple of them. One of them is House Bill 2001. And the only things that we need to address for January 1st of 2020 are new mandates regarding off-street parking and owner occupancy for accessory dwelling units. So this mandate prohibits the county from requiring owner occupancy. That is, that the owner of the subject property reside in either the primary dwelling or the ADU. The legislation says that come January 1st, we can no longer require that in the areas where ADUs are required. And I'll clarify that point later. It also prohibits us from requiring an additional off-street motor vehicle parking space for ADUs. So we would need to amend the ZDO to be in line with that. Number 7 is a state mandate that is implementing something that we, again, already do with regard to non-conforming licensed marijuana production premises. In a nutshell, it says that existing licensed premises can continue to operate under the rules that existed when they got licensed, and future owners of that license can do the same. So they don't have to change to keep up with new rules that the county might adopt with restrictions on licensed marijuana production. So last year we adopted that license number restriction per tract, correct? That's an example of a regulation that we would continue to still have to honor the licensed premises that exist, notwithstanding the new restrictions that were adopted. That's already what we do. If a property has 8 licensed premises, for example, that are already fully licensed, we already let them swap them out, etc. However, if they wanted to expand or make major modifications to that non-conforming site, this bill still allows us to consider additional adverse impacts to the neighborhood and to potentially disallow the proposed alteration. Finally, number 8 is the only federal mandate on the list, and I'm not going to say much about it at this point in the presentation other than just introduce that there is this mandate that we allow what are called small wireless facilities. It is a mandate. Technically, it's some guidance from the FCC that says, if you follow these rules, we might not sue you. But it functions as a mandate. Procedurally, it will require the county to allow small-scale wireless facilities, which I'll explain later, in public rights-of-way and on private property, with regard to only a few issues that could potentially restrict them, and there are reasons for that. They also require that we review proposals for the deployment of new small-scale facilities within new shot clock periods, that we don't take forever in getting back to an applicant on whether or not they can build that. So there are these mandates that we give an answer to proposals with certain defined periods. Those are the shot clocks. Enough on that item, though, for now. Any questions about these mandates?
That was pretty impressive. You went through all those. I don't think you looked at your notes once.
Okay, good.
Oh, this is very good. Any other questions from the commission? Yeah, no, that was great. Mike?
Yeah.
Not familiar with forest template dwelling.
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So in the ag, forest, and timber zones, these are our forest lands in the county, dwellings are not an outright permitted use. You can't just build a house out in timberland. There are some opportunities to get a new house on timberland anyhow, though, and one of the methods is through this template test method. And this template test has a literal template, it's digital now, it used to be physical, that we lay on the center of a piece of property where somebody wants to build a house. It's 160 acres in relative size, and we count up the number of separate legal lots of record and dwellings that existed in that square template on January 1st of 1993. And depending on the subject property's soil productivity level, in terms of the estimated amount of cubic feet of wood fiber per year the property might be able to produce, determines the number of houses and lots of record in 1993 that have to exist within that template. And if you reach that number, you too can have a house.
How do you prove what its cubic output is?
We formally adopt some schedules of soil productivity estimates. So there are these defined maps. I forget what federal agency or state agencies might define them. But there are these maps that have every inch of the county sort of blacked out with a code. And there's just this estimate of this area is predominantly this amount of space and is estimated to produce, therefore, this amount of cubic feet per year of wood fiber.
Would this be the same classification that's used for solar production? What can be done over certain classes of soil?
I think that it is, more or less, except sometimes we're talking about the soil quality of farmland. In this case, we're talking about the soil quality in terms of its wood fiber production capability of forest land.
Okay.
Awesome. Keep
Great.
going.
Just a couple of points on the clarifications and corrections, which we might address in this package, and we might find a couple more between now and February. One of them is pretty straightforward. The last piece of property in the county that has the campus industrial district plan designation and zone has been annexed by the city of Lake Oswego. And indeed, the comprehensive plan practically prohibits us from being able to apply that same designation anywhere else. So we'll just remove it from the code and from the comp plan. We've got a handful of amendments to the sections related to the natural resource zones. So things where we've had text on the books for a number of years, but the state law has since changed. We may be implementing that state law already, but we just need to catch up the text in the code to keep up. And those are enumerated in the staff report. I'd like to save the majority of the time, though, unless you have any questions up till now, on these 11 options that we have. And I'll start first with two that connect with these state mandates that we've talked about. The first one is parking for ADUs where they're not mandatory. So the county allows accessory dwelling units in areas where the state doesn't require it, specifically up near Mount Hood. We're not required to allow ADUs up there, but we do so optionally. And as I mentioned, House Bill 2001 prohibits us from having an owner occupancy requirement and requiring an off-street parking space for where we're required to allow them. And one suggestion is to transpose that to where else we allow ADUs, in a sense. So up in the Mount Hood corridor, we have two residential zoning districts that allow for ADUs. One is the HR district and one is the MRR district. And for a couple of reasons that I'm happy to explain if you'd like, the HR zone does require one off-street parking space already for an ADU, but no owner occupancy requirement. The MRR zone requires that one off-street parking space and an owner occupancy requirement. And if we want to be consistent with how we're required to treat ADUs in urban areas, we might remove the off-street parking space requirement for these as well, and the owner occupancy requirement. And that would create some administrative benefit to us, and that it's just easier, and we don't maybe get tripped up forgetting about this one special exception in other areas. But I think it's important to think about maybe it's appropriate to still have one off-street parking space required up in the Mount Hood area if there's concerns that some of those roads are too narrow or are subpar in comparison to those here towards Oregon City and elsewhere. And maybe we don't want to create an incentive to put more vehicles in rights of way that are so narrow. So we don't have to remove that requirement, but we could. And maybe we just want to open that up for discussion.
Commissioner Murphy?
Yes, absolutely, Brad.
I'll let you
saw it.
start.
Go first.
Yes, I'd bring up snow removal to begin with. If there is snow on the ground, usually the right-of-ways are very limited in their widths. And having an on-street parking would definitely be an obstacle to future snow removal. So if it's still snowing and you have an accessory dwelling parking out in the street, you're gonna have an issue with snow removal that's not gonna be able to be completed, so.
Thank you.
I had a question about the locations of the HR district and the MRR. Where's each one, roughly?
Yeah, all up in the Mount Hood corridor around the areas of Government Camp, Wemmy Welch's, Rhododendron, and beyond. The MRR district more specifically in those denser urbanized, more urban-like areas, and the HR beyond those and less dense. I have a couple of maps on some slides later that has some too I can show you.
I have a question. What has been the public reaction to these parking requirements?
Good question. I myself, just at the public service counter, haven't encountered anybody proposing an ADU in these areas, period. And I don't know how many ADUs we have approved in this area. And I don't know how much requiring the off-street parking space might preclude somebody's ability to cite an ADU or not.
Did you have something you wanted?
No.
Okay. Christine?
Oh, I did attend one of your open houses that had the 175 people, I think, that showed up. And this was definitely an issue, was the parking.
Yeah,
for
that was the short-term rental
Short-term rental,
project.
right, exactly.
Correct.
And so these ADUs could be used as a short-term rental, couldn't they?
They could, in theory, if we actually adopt amendments to enable short-term rentals, which of course, currently the county doesn't really allow, but we're moving toward sort of recognizing reality potentially and adopting some regulations to explicitly allow and regulate them.
And so this could be an issue with its parking in the street.
Correct.
Yeah, I tend to be a big fan of consistency, but I think the argument is a good one. I think obviously Mount Hood deals with snow unlike any other place in this county, really, and it's a pretty big deal. I agree with that. Are there other thoughts for Glenn on this particular topic?
Yeah, I have a question. Why is there a difference in owner occupancy requirements between the two areas?
That's a good question. And the answer is because before last year, we did not allow ADUs in the MRR zone at all. We allowed them in the HR zone, and the rules on the books already did not have an owner occupancy requirement. And last year, when we expanded where you can allow ADUs, we didn't want to add new restrictions to the HR zone by newly adding an owner occupancy requirement. So we sort of just left it as it was. But when we allowed ADUs newly in the MRR district, we brought with it the owner occupancy requirement to be in line with those in urban areas.
So you may recall, those of you who were on the planning commission at the time, you actually recommended no owner occupancy requirement is my recollection. I'm looking at Martha, I believe that's correct. But the board ended up adding it in when it went to them. And so right, at this point, because it's not gonna apply anywhere in the urban area, because it can't, and then it already doesn't apply in HR, we would be left with an owner occupancy requirement only in MRR. And I think from staff's perspective, that doesn't make much sense, whereas the parking piece feels different because there's an actual distinction with the roadways and the snow that it might make sense.
Could you walk me through like an MRR example where an existing house has an occupant? Do we have a requirement for 2 parking stalls on property for that and then, or could they use one of their existing parking spaces to say, oh, well, my ADU is using the second stall, and I'm now parking 3 cars on the street?
It's my understanding that the dwelling, the primary dwelling, is going to have its own off-street parking requirement. What it would be in this district, I would have to look up, but it might be something like 2 off-street parking spaces. And then the ADU, to have an ADU on that lot in the MRR zone, you have to provide another space.
As long as that's where I was kind of going, as long as it's
Yeah.
a +1 and not
Correct.
a situation where the burden is put upon the public street.
Correct.
So, thank you.
Here we go.
Very good. The second item is related to that. Different from ADUs, we have accessory historic dwellings, AHDs. These are in different areas of the county. So accessory historic dwellings, the county chose to allow. We're not required to allow them, but we chose to. And we chose to allow them where we're allowed to do so, which is outside of urban growth boundaries and outside of urban reserves in areas where detached single-family dwellings are permitted outright. So we're talking the RRFF5 zone, the R2 zone, those places outside of urban areas. No, thank you. Accessory historic dwellings are somewhat opposite of ADUs in that the existing dwelling becomes the accessory dwelling when a new home is put on that property. That existing dwelling, if you'll recall, can only have a new dwelling on that same lot if the existing dwelling was built between 1850 and 1945, and some other criteria. It looks like we've only so far approved maybe half a dozen of these in the county. And we have right now an owner occupancy requirement similar to that for ADUs. We could repeal the owner occupancy requirement for these somewhat analogous situations. And I'll just answer some questions if you have any.
What does the person have to do to prove that the dwelling qualifies for those years?
They're going to have to prove the age of the structure. And in most cases, what people are doing to do that is they provide us tax assessment records that often show the date or an estimated date of construction. They might be able to, if they don't have that for whatever reason, they might have some other evidence that they can present.
Yeah, I was just thinking out where I live, a lot of the properties came on the tax records anywhere up to 50 years after they were actually built. And they were actually built around the turn of the other century, and there's no records until mid-century. So I just wondered
Yeah.
if there's carbon dating or, I'm just joking kind of, but other ways to prove that that is truly a pioneer building versus modern.
Yeah, hopefully we don't have to get too nitpicky with what they provide us, but in theory, they could provide us all different types of evidence.
Okay.
Well, my recollection when we adopted this was one of the big arguments was that this allowed, someone to finance their home or to make some money off of property that otherwise would not go used or whatever there, some reason of preserving a historic building. And so it seems to me when you require an owner occupancy, it really inhibits the ability to do that. And it doesn't seem consistent with everything else that we're doing. I come back to, I think there's a lot of value in consistency where we can across the rules. I think you guys have expressed that too. So that's my personal view of, I just don't, barring some really strong argument for why owner occupation is really necessary, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
And I agree with you that consistency, when possible, is better.
Can you remember or share why the Board of County Commissioners were more in favor of, was their reasoning?
I don't know that. Okay.
Impacts the neighborhoods and neighborhood character, concerns about absentee owners.
Right, with 2 rentals, yeah, 2 rentals on one piece of property, creating impacts for the neighborhood.
With all 6 of them in the county.
Yeah.
It was a larger, at that point, of course, it was the larger ADU conversation. Now we're down to just this very narrow because we've lost the authority to control it in other places. And so yes, I would say when you're talking about this sliver, it just
Right.
increases the likelihood staff's going to make a mistake because we're used to telling, 95% of the time, sure, no problem, and then we're going to miss one. I'd rather avoid that if I can, unless there's a
Well, it just
compelling.
seems we're letting it go everywhere else, whether we have control over that or not. And so to force it on these 6 people just doesn't make sense to me.
I'm sure there's more. They
Yeah,
just haven't
there will be
applied
more.
yet.
They'll show up. Other thoughts on this?
Does a historic barn qualify as a historic structure? No, it has to be inhabited by humans. Okay.
Dwelling. Human dwelling, not an animal
Okay.
dwelling.
Well, yeah, that's some other animals.
County.
Yeah,
Brave argument, though.
very good. Thank
All
you.
right. Kennels.
Well, yeah, so this is the next of the options. This is the first one, again, specifically called out in the work program for some discussion. And I wasn't here at the time that the work program was put together, but as I understand, there was a planning commissioner who was interested in exploring ideas to streamline the process for getting approval of kennels in rural residential zones. There wasn't any specific guidance on how to do that, but there was some testimony in the creation of the work program from someone who has an RRFF5 lot that might not be able to meet some setback requirements that apply to these kennels, and that's what I'll talk about. So right now, kennels can be allowed in rural residential zones. Those are the ones listed at the top there, with a conditional use permit. So they have to get approval from the hearings officer after consideration of site-specific dynamics, nearby land uses, topography, all those site-unique things. So that's already required. And in addition to that, the kennel has to be set back 200 feet from all property lines, whatever the other cases of the property might be, even if there aren't any other neighbors around. And so maybe one consideration is that the 200-foot setback requirement isn't necessary. Maybe the conditional use permit process itself will be able to consider whether a specific proposal for a kennel on a specific piece of property can work without harming the neighbors. So it might be possible, if you think it's necessary, to reduce the setback to something smaller. As I noted in the staff report, Multnomah and Washington counties have a 100-foot setback for a similar use in similar areas. Or maybe you don't think it's necessary to have any specific setback requirement at all and just allow the conditional use process to evaluate each site by each site. So I've kind of described in the staff report what are some of the potential impacts of a kennel. Some of them might be fairly obvious: noise, smell, maybe lighting if there's outdoor play areas. To be clear, even if we reduce the setback or remove it altogether, there would still be a conditional use permit process required.
I wanted to ask about this here in the notes. It says that the same districts allow farm use outright without requiring additional setback, and that's for livestock, hemp production, chicken farms. So there's no setback requirement for those.
Just the same setbacks as for any structure. So in these zones,
Okay.
30 feet from the front, 10 feet from the side, 30 feet from the rear, or
And
10
then-
feet from the rear.
And also says the 200-foot setback for the commercial dog kennels is 4 times as deep as the minimum for indoor commercial marijuana, which also, of course, can have noise and odor and all those things. So it seems like the restrictions for the dog kennels are way more severe in the sense of the 200-foot setback than all these others, which could have equal and same impact.
Potentially. I wanted to make sure I noted in the staff report, though, that with regard to marijuana, well, you could have a marijuana production facility in these same zones just 50 feet from the property line. It can only be indoors. There's odor filtration requirements and there's a noise standard. So there's something kind of helping keep track of maybe noises and odors that might drift across a property line.
Unless it's medical. Right. It would grow right on the property line, arguably.
It depends. Not always. There are some there's some provisions about non-conforming buildings where we had to allow if they were they'd been registered like as a medical grower by a certain date, they can do it in a building that's closer to the property line. Otherwise, they do, and then there are some exceptions for medical growers, but they have to actually meet 100-foot setback to avoid things like the noise and odor and all of that. So, yeah.
I'm curious, without allowing the conditional use process to resolve issues, does that then set precedents for other folks, or are you is there an ability to rule each one individually based on its merits, and regardless of how you might ruled on a previous one, there's no grounds for them to say, well, you did it, you allowed it this way over here? That would be the only question I would have is, when you leave it open, does it really get resolved, and then do you create some other unintended consequences that where if you have a specific rule, it's fairly easy to enforce?
So you're wondering if I'm understanding correctly, if there's a specific conditional use permit that happens, somebody proposes a kennel, it gets approved with a 30-foot setback, the hearings officer concludes it's fine, they can meet all the requirements, then moving forward, will we kind of use that as the default in all cases?
Or you may have another applicant where they say, nope, it's got to be 100 foot, and they'll go, but you said it was 35
Right.
feet here. Why can't I do that?
So the way conditional use permits should work, if things are operating correctly, is that they are in fact site-specific. And so, for example, if somebody came in and proposed a kennel on a piece of property that butted up against BLM land with no house within, a mile from their back property line, it's hard to argue that really you need a 200-foot setback. So in that case, I think that would get factored in, as opposed to, your property line, abuts a subdivision of 1-acre lots. We really need to pull this farther from the property line. So that's how it should work. Now, having said that, and Glenn and I talked about this a little bit, when you have the very specific standards, then you are guaranteeing that there is a minimum set of standards that will apply in every case, that there isn't really a way. In theory, you could do a setback variance, but for something like this, it would be almost insurmountable, that it wouldn't get approved. I don't see a way it could. So you're kind of just, you've sort of guaranteed that will always happen, that you'll have the 200 feet, as opposed to trusting in this conditional use process. So I think there are arguments, and, we have, for both. We have done, our code right now is really an interesting mix, where there are a lot of conditional uses where there are no standards beyond the basic zone setbacks and then the conditional use criteria. And then there are a whole host of uses that have very specific standards. Composting facilities, there's just certain things where we went through these processes. The kennel one's interesting. It's been in the code as long as I've worked here. So we're talking about over 25 years. I mean, it might date to the 60s. I'm really not sure. And it's the only special standard that we have for kennels. So there's not like a whole section like we have, say, for marijuana production or for composting, where there's maybe, a dozen or 2 dozen standards you're applying. So it is a little weird that it's just kind of this sort of one-off. And yeah, it just results in there's a whole bunch of properties that have no hope of qualifying. And maybe that's okay. But we had that discussion with Commissioner Fitz, having some concerns about some specific uses, I think, that people had approached him about in Damascus, and really wanting to try to figure out a path for those folks.
I'm imagining Commissioner Fitz at 2 a.m. watching government access and,
Yeah.
and just yelling at the
Exactly.
So hi, Mark.
One of the things I just looked up was an acre is 43,500 square feet. So 200 by 200 off of every boundary isn't even 1 acre. And for a lot of people, that could be a lot of property. Am I calculating wrong, Jennifer?
I don't know.
Okay.
I have to get out my
It's under an
calculator.
acre.
208 by
It
208.
seems.
208 by 208 is an acre, correct. So this
you
would,
need 400 plus the width of the building.
right,
In each
right.
direction in order to meet the
So you'd
setbacks.
need
Yeah.
probably at least an acre, and in some circumstances, as you're saying, that could be not a problem, surrounded by forest or pastures or whatever. But that acre could also be within an RR1, all the surrounding areas are 1 acre places, and that's where that could be pretty worrisome. And I think one of the elements that you didn't mention was traffic, because those do bring quite a bit of traffic every morning, every evening, so.
So Christine and Steve wanted to get in.
So I just wanted, Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask really quickly, the 200-foot setback, since it's been here for so long, if there is any sense of historically what issue they were trying to address with such a substantial setback?
I don't know. We haven't gone back to actually look and see if we could figure out any history behind it. I mean, the best I could probably do is go back and look at our first zoning code from 1960, figure out if it was in there then, try to figure out when it was added. You know, I'm sure we could figure it out and share that with you
It's not
next time
known.
around, but I
That's
don't
fine.
know.
No.
Loud barking dogs next to residential.
Yeah.
neighborhoods.
Most likely.
Well, because if you look at this, the interesting thing to me is obviously you guys don't regulate whether or not someone has a dog. You also don't regulate whether or not someone has a dog that they allow to be outside. I mean, and so this whole thing that a single dog bark is going to be 80 to 100 decibels in the country. When you go door knocking, lots and lots of people have dogs, and lots of people have loud dogs. And so it's interesting that, you know, that could possibly be the issue here, but I mean, you don't generally regulate pets, and the noise is the noise is the noise for this.
When you get a large group of dogs together, they can be exceptionally loud.
Right, but in that case, you could probably do requirements to try to abate that based on the design or whatever you could require of that kennel. I mean, it doesn't have to be a setback to be able to address noise, I guess is what I'm saying.
Right, so the conditional use process would allow the application of conditions of approval to mitigate impacts. They don't have to, you know, necessarily meet all the standards right up front. We could say, for instance, well, in this case, we are going to require a bigger setback than what you proposed, maybe not 200 feet. Or we're going to require that more of your area be indoors, or we're going to require you to limit the hours that dogs are allowed to be outside. I mean, there are a number of things that we can do. And that happens routinely in the conditional use process. You'll just lose that absolute certainty of the 200 feet. And traffic would definitely, that's addressed in all conditional use permits.
Right.
Maybe not always to everybody's satisfaction, but there is a standard for that.
Right.
So.
Steve?
Yeah, so thank you very much for the information. I learn every time I come here, I learn about something new. On this one, I kind of think, hey, I need to go slow. I need to understand more because I can't say that necessarily the public comment phase of complaining, if something was to be granted, that we would have a line up here. But I could see that if we made have no setbacks, I could see that some people would be upset and wanting to come and complain about how their dwelling is no longer for their enjoyment because these animals can go up into the fence line of the property line. Like I heard you can regulate like number of hours they're outside. I think that's great. But the 200-foot setback is for the building. Is that for the building itself?
In this case, I think the setback would be for the entire kennel use. I mean, typically setbacks are only for, you know, traditionally they're for structures. We don't regulate, you know, the setback of who's hanging out in your backyard or your dogs. But this type of use, I think it would be all, and I can't remember if the language actually says that,
Yeah, I think it says the kennel use.
something like that.
Does,
yeah.
does the language go into the density? I mean, you know, when you talk about if we increase, you know, R1 to not have setbacks, where you have 200 feet on all sides, you can have a lot more number of animals. So that does have impact on neighbors and neighborhoods.
So all we're addressing here are dogs. Because I do remember we had a citizen come in here who was complaining about a rooster, and that was not regulated, and that was in a residential area.
Right, so our code does not treat livestock and dogs the same way. Historically, they have been different, whether we agree or don't agree. Historically, those two things have been different. And in some zones, we don't have any choice on the livestock regulations because they're a farm use. And we can't restrict right to farm and all. But in our rural residential zones, we could choose to restrict livestock. We just never have. And so if you go out and start doing that, it's a bit controversial.
And that brings us to the point here where the 3 of the 4 zones we're talking about that allow the farm use outright, including the livestock and the chicken farms, and those can be very smelly and very noisy too. So it just seems like, with the exception of the RA1, we've got 2 different standards going on.
So, someone who owns a dog and kennels them regularly, I have a few thoughts on this. Starting with, I really do believe the kenneling folks that we have in our county serve a critical need and a really important role, and it should be easier than it is to put these things on the ground because there's not enough of them right now. You try to kennel your dog on a holiday weekend, and it's very difficult. And so I think it is a really valuable service. I do understand as a dog owner some of the concerns around that. And I think, for example, I may be wrong, but I seem to recall there's actually an exception for dog barks in the noise ordinance during the day. And so I think that, and I may be wrong about that, but I thought dog barking was exempt from like 8 to 6 during the day. But either way, I think it's, the noise is the biggest factor coming out of that. And I think that the setback almost depends on whether there are a wide variety of dog kenneling options, right? There are indoor and outdoor and a combination of both. And to some extent, the indoor kennels don't have that noise issue as the outdoor ones. And so it seems to me that the setback isn't really necessary when you're actually putting the dogs in a building for the most part. So, some kennels will go walk the dogs individually during the day, and some of them have this giant play area. And, the flip side is usually, most dogs aren't barking consistently during the day. It's only that one or two problem dog that they may have from time to time. And I think if there is something in the process of requiring them to have an indoor place to take that dog or some other way of addressing that solves a lot of that problem.
So you're proposing that you allow the conditional use process would factor that in?
I mean, I think the conditional use process could deal with a lot of it. I really do.
Is this only for commercial? So you could be a private resident and have hounds
Yeah.
to go
Yes.
hunting with
You could arguably
hounds.
do a home occupation.
Yes.
This reminds
the-
me of the horse
ADU?
discussion.
This is
we
not
had.
the easiest question. You would think that would be an easy question to answer. There's a lot of history regarding kennels in our code. So the actual definition of a kennel is the keeping of 4 or more adult dogs. I'm paraphrasing a bit, for any purpose. So that arguably you're a kennel if you have five dogs that are pets. Our Board of County Commissioners did a code interpretation about 20 years ago, roughly, and said, yeah, no, that's not what it means. We're not regulating people's pets. And so what it is now is if you are keeping those dogs for the purpose of obtaining a commercial profit, then you're a kennel. So it could be a doggy daycare and still be a kennel. It could be a boarding, a traditional boarding kennel. It could be some sort of breeding facility, and it would still be a kennel. But the key is that they are above the 4 adult dogs and that it is a commercial operation.
And just to follow, I think if you reduce the amount of setbacks, which I think is a good idea, you've got to deal with the potential for the noise ordinance violation, right? Or the reality is that I think the real problem is that it technically wouldn't necessarily violate the noise ordinance because it's one dog barking here and there, but when they bark consistently all day long, that's the problem, right? And so I think the conditional use process needs to set some sort of more stringent noise standard on the kennel, or at least have some procedures in place that are designed to reduce that problem. Because honestly, I think that's between the traffic and the noise, those are the only two things that a neighbor is really potentially going to notice. And if
Smell.
it's done correctly, you can address both of them.
Smell.
See, and I think, Brian, I'd almost go the opposite direction with, I think the 200 setback just is barely enough. Because unfortunately, I live in an extreme rural environment.
Right.
And when we have noise problems, I'm not going to get a deputy out there with his little barometer to say, yep, it's 61 decibels, it's over. That just never happens. There's no real code enforcement of
totally
stuff like that. So unfortunately, I think it's a part of why it was set back so far is because there's just no way to control that. And so 200 would be something I would really support, but
Well, yeah, I agree with that. That's the problem, with whether it's dog barks or
Oh, yeah.
gun shooting, whatever, no
Yep.
one can measure that. So I think actually the non-conforming, or the whole conditional use process can actually create some standards around things they have to do to mitigate that from the front end, right? The other thing I would throw out is, as much as I like dog kennels, is a 1 acre piece of property really appropriate for it, right? And so, maybe we want to reduce the setback so it's easier on 3 to 4 to 5 acre pieces of property to fit them into that property. But maybe 1 or 2 is just too small, especially when it's right next to a residential neighborhood. I don't know the answer to that. But.
I agree. And there isn't a minimum, is there, Glenn, as far as the number of acres that they have to
No.
actually own? I didn't think so, yeah.
Yeah, and that's
I thought 1 acre was really quite small.
It also depends on how many dogs,
Yeah.
right? How big the business is. If you've got a small number of dogs on 2 acres, maybe that's not a big deal. But if you're, supporting the entire county's worth of dog owners,
Right.
you need a bigger piece of property. And
Do you guys know where these kennels are located now that may or may not have the opportunity to go through this process to be formalized?
Just one property owner had testified during the work program about this, and I have their property. I don't know where it is off the top of my head, though, but it's just that one case. And as to the minimum acreage requirement, Multnomah County and Washington County have smaller setbacks, just 100 feet. But Washington County does have a minimum lot size requirement for a kennel as well, 5 acres.
Oh,
that
interesting.
may make some sense.
I think the setback is too big, but it seems like the setback is too big, but
What-
that the lot minimum makes good sense.
I would agree.
One thing that we want to be cautious of in this package is not adding new restrictions to properties right now. So that's why we're proposing in this package to just consider whether that existing regulation should be kept, reduced, or eliminated entirely. And then if there's ideas about how to address properties that today would qualify so that they consider potential noise impacts, maybe have greater setback requirements, we might want to consider for a different ordinance.
You could arguably, though, reduce the setback on properties of X number of acres or over and not affect those other properties, right?
Yeah, I imagine just, spitballing, you might be able to write something that says, you keep all the requirements the same, 200 feet from property lines, unless your property is X number of acres potentially, or you demonstrate that you have a plan for that the proposed use won't exceed a certain decibel level, something like that.
Or maybe it's a number of dogs per day.
Yeah.
I don't see how reducing the setback on a larger piece is going to really materially affect if that adjacent property's right up there and we had it 200 feet and you said, well, you can get it within 50 feet. Well, you move that kennel right up to the 50-foot line from the next property. Well, what have you done? Even though the property's bigger, the kennel is just as close to his neighbor.
But
Isn't that what conditional use is for, though? You guys work that stuff out through the conditional use process?
I think arguably, though, the answer to that is that they can move their building closer to the lot line and house dogs into it. And, when the dogs are in the building, the impact isn't as great. But with that 200-foot setback, you've got to push that building way far in when it, I question whether when you've got dogs in a building, whether 100 feet or 200 feet makes any difference. But it certainly would make a difference when someone's trying to configure the kennel on their property and not being able to put a building where they want because they're housing dogs in it.
Well, you're assuming they're going to put the dogs in the house. They may have them running free out there.
Right, or they may decide to build a outdoor barn or shed or whatnot, which is one of the kennels I use does that regularly. When it's raining, they'll bring the dogs into a certain area, right, indoors, or whether it's cold or overnight. And when you've got the dogs indoors and, I think there's less of an impact and it doesn't really require that huge setback.
If the setback were to be reduced from 200, they would come for building permit, and if they were to change the configuration of their property to have a kennel closer to the setback. But if we did a change from 200 to be less, that would apply to everybody existing, and somebody could then just come and do another permit.
That's an interesting question. I wonder, it's, if somebody has a conditional use permit already with specific conditions that it be set back a certain distance, I think they need to go through a modification process, so a land use application to change that condition.
And the reason I am asking is I'm just trying to put my head into, I'm now the existing neighbor and things change. I would like to know that there's a process to protect my enjoyment of my dwelling.
Yep. And modifications would be publicly noticed to neighbors.
Okay, thank you.
So to respond to the discussion earlier about what the setback applies to, I thought, hey, how about if I actually get the code out? And I dug it out of the box back there. The portion of the premises used shall be located a minimum of 200 feet from all property lines. So it's everything that they're using for the kennel. So it's the building, it's the outdoor area, et cetera. The parking lot, presumably, I mean, whatever they have going on needs to be 200 feet. So what Glenn was saying earlier, I do want to clarify a little bit why we're cautioning you about new restrictions. Because this is a minor amendments package, we're not, this isn't a, hey, let's go out and invent all these new standards for kennels. They might be great, but that's a bigger work program than this. And we're not wanting to impose new restrictions that would generate individual property mailings because it's very expensive. And so that's outside the scope of this project. This doesn't mean it couldn't be done in the future. If you wanted to say, hey, we want to look at kennels in 2 years when the work program comes up, we could. But at this point, we're trying to limit the universe to what we said, which was minor amendments. And so, yes, I think you could, as Glenn said, build in instead, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You could say 200 feet except, but then we would have to know what the criteria would be to get that exception.
But I can take,
So, yeah,
sure.
you need some direction here, because we're all over the map, right? I mean, I think this obviously needs more discussion to do it right. If we're trying to do it in the short term, I think it makes some sense to at least reduce those setbacks for a certain size acre. Maybe we start with, we have that 200 feet except for properties of 5 acres or more, whatever that number might be, kind of splits the baby a little bit, maybe allows some of these, somebody who really wants to put in a kennel, gives them more options, but also continues to protect property owners. And maybe we can see how that goes and have a discussion next year or so about whether it goes farther.
And maybe we could limit to certain zones, period. Just like what it is now.
Right.
Yep, maybe even a little tighter.
Yeah, but it still doesn't answer the question I had before. You got 5 acres, and you say you're gonna put it at 50 feet. Where in that 5 acres? You're gonna put it right up on the line, right up next to the other's property. So what is saying 200 or 50 or whatever gonna do if you don't say exactly how far from the next piece of property? The noise is going to be there. You say 5 acres, you can put it within 50 feet. Well, okay. So my kennel butts right up on the line at 50 feet. And where somebody over here has got 200 feet up.
Being it doesn't matter if it's 5 acres or 1 acre, you're still right up against the property line.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear that.
So what if we were just to say, well, all right, just let's let the conditional use process figure it out. You'll have some applications and feedback, or potentially there'll be some issues or things that come up that then might warrant, okay, we need to take a tighter look at this and study it because to me, a lot of things we're proposing are all more than minor in my mind. So in my mind, it seems like either we just say, leave it as is, or we go, all right, let's just try the conditional use approach, see how it works out. If it's a problem, then we come back and we take a harder look at it. That's my suggestion.
And I still come back to the fact that the farm uses have no setbacks. The livestock, the chickens, they're noisy, they're stinky, and they can be right up to the property line, obviously, in these small acreage zones, and yet there's no requirements for them. So the dog people could say, well, hey, you're discriminating against dogs, but it's okay to have these cattle and chickens, right up to the property line, making the noise, making the odors. That I can see an issue there.
I think the irony is that as I think about standing on my property, I hear dogs barking all the time. But when I actually go to a kennel, it's silent, right? And I think the difference is that they're actually watching the dogs every day and they're managing them as opposed to having a dog running on the property all the time. And I actually think the bigger problem is with individual homeowners than it is potentially these businesses. And that's where I come back to the whole. The process can put some procedures in place to make sure that there's people on site that are making sure that those dogs aren't barking all day. I just think that the process could solve this problem.
Thank you. We have another opportunity in January to hash through this some more, and maybe in jotting down some of your comments and ideas, we can sort of process it and come back with some suggestions about all that.
Hopefully a lot of people are watching government access TV.
Yeah.
Will call us with suggestions.
Should I say my email address
I know
now?
my phone's gonna be ringing
Yeah,
off the
I know.
hook tonight.
I'm for treating dogs just like we treat the rest of the farm animals.
Like roosters.
Could have a chicken ranch, right, or a rooster ranch, yes, with no setback.
So, and that'd be pretty loud.
What do we have next, Glenn?
Very good. Number 4 is another item specifically called out in the work program. It's small-scale manufacturing in what we're calling community commercial zones. The county's comprehensive plans, community commercial plan designation is implemented by 2 different zones, the C2 zone and the RTC zone. The C2 zone here in the metro area of Portland, the RTC zone, similar in concept, but out in Mount Hood. Right now, the C2 zone prohibits the primary processing of raw materials. You can't do that in the C2 zone. Theoretically, that prohibits the processing of hops or grapes into wine, those sort of raw ingredients. In the RTC zone, all processing and manufacturing is prohibited. In the discussion of the work program, there was some feedback that this may be creating some missed opportunities for the county, and certain land uses that are caught by these prohibitions may otherwise be appropriate for the zones. And so that's maybe what we'll talk about here. This small-scale manufacturing concept was fleshed out a little bit more in a recent meeting that planning staff had with representatives of the Oak Grove Community Council just a couple of weeks ago, where we heard what they were hoping to be able to allow in the C2 zoned areas of their community. And we looked at some maps of where the C2 zone is elsewhere in the county. And what we heard from that group was that they're hoping for the ability to cite something like a brewery where there is a retail component on the same site. So a brewery that might manufacture some beer and indeed might distribute it to other locations elsewhere, but where they're doing some retail component effort there as well. The group also shared that maybe it's not just consumables that we want to allow, so things like beer, juice, tea, but maybe also some the manufacturing of certain crafts. Maybe it's glass work, for example. Maybe you're producing glass items and you want to be able to retail it there on the same property as well. So this is the discussion that we had, and I'll share a little bit more about it after I first show you a couple of maps. There are, I believe, 5 areas, 5 little pockets of the Portland metro area where there's C2 zoning. There is some right in the heart of Oak Grove at the corner of Oak Grove Boulevard and River Road. There's some C2 zone property, if you can see it, just in the middle at the intersection of King Road and Linwood Avenue. at Thiessen Road and Webster Road, and at Sunnyside Road and 122nd. And then finally at the corner of Highway 212 and 135th. So there are these 5 pockets. You might be more familiar with these areas than I am, or at least as they are today, that it's a whole mix of different uses right there and nearby. There are things like delis, automobile service stations, grocery stores, banks, a whole variety of sort of commercial uses. And the parcels that are currently undeveloped are generally smaller, so there's not a lot of space where somebody could potentially put in a huge beer manufacturing operation. There's just not a lot of properties for that. And up in the Mount Hood area, the RTC zone, here in pink, if you can make it out on the map, are spaces that are zoned rural tourist commercial. They include, I believe, if this property over to the west might be the site of the Mount Hood Brewery. So just keep that in mind. The map of Wemmy and Welch's has these areas of RTC along the highway shown in pink. And then in rhododendron, there's some space along the highway as well, zoned RTC. So as I said, the available properties, those that are potentially capable of being redeveloped, are generally smaller in size. There's a mix of nearby uses already that at least the representatives of the Oak Grove Community Council and staff feel like would not be out of character or a problem for having small-scale manufacturing where there's an on-site retail component. It's important to note that any new commercial development, any new building will still need design review, regardless if we allow this type of use in these 2 zones. So we'll be looking at things like parking, on-site circulation, the building's aesthetics, utilities, all those factors nonetheless. A question for the Planning Commission, in addition to should we just pursue this even further, is should we require there to be an on-site retail component, or should we allow just manufacturing as it is without necessarily retailing of any of the goods manufactured on-site there? And then also, what would we allow to be manufactured? Would it just be consumable goods, things like beer, wine, juice, baked goods? Or do we want to think of a way to allow the manufacture of other items that are also sold on-site? Glassware. It was brought up in our meeting with the Oak Grove representatives. Well, what about the possibility of the manufacture of bike parts? What if somebody wanted to make bike parts and also sell them at their store in the C2 zone? So staff's recommendation might be that, at least for this project, minor amendments, that something just kind of more narrow, like consumable goods, might be appropriate without going too far down the road of everything else that might make sense. But it's open for discussion.
Question, can you go back to slide number 10? And could you describe MR1?
That's a residential zone, a medium density residential zone.
Okay.
And there's MR2 there as well.
And are you saying MR1 would be part of the conversation for?
No, just the C2 zone and just the RTC zone in the Mount Hood area.
So the
which is a
C2 next
commercial
to the
zone.
MR1?
Yep.
Thank you.
So RTC, rural, tourist, commercial,
Correct.
or residential tourist commercial? What is it?
Rural tourist commercial.
Okay. And typically, what was that type of business? It would be something like, before we're looking at the breweries and things like that, what were we looking at these businesses being?
It's a wide range of commercial uses. The same as the C2. It allows a wide range of retailing, bars, restaurants. You know, you can pretty much sell any kind of store, grocery store, you know, services like dry cleaners or barbers and any of those kinds of
But you
things.
can't manufacture anything.
Correct. Yes, there's this limitation on manufacturing. And the history of this was that the Oak Grove Community Council has raised this, I believe, with us maybe more than once.
Yep.
And this year, the board, I mean, you recommended it be included, and the board might have narrowed it further. They very clearly said this is a minor amendment. This is not a full, blown, let's go out and analyze all the impacts of manufacturing everywhere and figure out the perfect solution. It is, hey, we've got this targeted potential amendment to address a specific concern that's been brought to us. And so I think the specific concern initially in Oak Grove was we'd like to have a brew pub that we could walk to on a, Friday evening and have a burger and a beer and, hang out on the sidewalk in Oak Grove and, like we've seen in other places. And their concern is that may not happen if we will not allow that brewing component where they could distribute to other bars and restaurants or grocery stores and have that manufacturing element. The same thing with bakeries. Hey, we'd like to have a corner bakery and be able to go sit down there and have a pastry and a cup of coffee, but they need to be able to sell their product elsewhere, which pushes it out of the kind of retail component and into the manufacturing. So that's just kind of the background of what we heard from them. And then Glenn has had these further conversations where these questions about limiting, do we limit the type of product? And I think they were advocating for the retail component.
Yeah.
I think from my perspective, I would advocate for the retail component because these really are our commercial areas. And if the idea is to create that kind of lively streetscape, walkable kind of thing, I don't think you want to go to complete manufacturing.
I think you change the whole purpose of the zone if you don't keep it tied to commercial, some sort of commercial use.
What do you think the economic impact is going to be? Any idea?
Well, representatives of the Oak Grove Community Council were advocating for this on-site retail component in hopes to be able to use the site for multiple purposes at different times of the day. So maybe during the day, a site in the manufacturing of beer might be mostly people who work for the brewery. And then in the evening, those people have gone home and they can use the same site for a brew pub, and that they can kind of add to or layer the types of uses that happen on one specific piece of property.
Good. I mean, I go down McLaughlin and I see businesses closed up. We need to get some more economic development down there.
I think if this is a minor amendment, it
I
makes sense to
understand that.
maintain retail. I agree with that. And I think also you want to maintain it in consumables and not open it wide open to any manufacturing whatsoever. Because I think that if that's their intent to have that kind of walkable street thing, that's not exactly somebody manufacturing bicycle parts. I mean, that's somebody making beer or,
I
making
agree with
you know.
that. Although
Yeah, that's a very, very good point.
the only thing I would go beyond that is like, I could imagine like artistic products, right? Like almost the glass where it gets to it, or some sculpturist wants to do sculpture manufacturing there and sell it or something like that. I don't know. But it's that ultimately you're trying to relate it to, you're trying to attract businesses that are going to enhance that the existing commercial zone and not detract from it. And you're right, some businesses will do that. And at some point you get close to the manufacturing of products, which doesn't really fit.
So I have a
don't
question
want a
about that for the
planer.
artistic part. Can I ask that
Yeah.
to clarify? So it seems like if you were making the glass, that would be manufacturing. But if you're taking a product and you are creating something with it,
It's not quite, yeah.
is that really
I
manufacturing?
don't think so. I think you're right.
So the difference between glass blowing?
I mean, it's like
Yeah.
if somebody in there is
Right.
painting a picture and then they hang it on the wall and sell it, they didn't manufacture that picture. I mean, it's different.
Yeah, it's glass blowing, manufacturing, commercial, kind of skirts that gray area, right?
Well, I know Government Camp has like a foundry, and it's for teaching. It's for teaching blacksmithing. But they do produce, and it's probably noisy, and it probably does have
But
some
it's manufacturing.
output. But it's more of a gallery, or not a gallery, but a studio type work. You sign up for classroom.
Like
they-
Lincoln City glass blowing or whatever.
Exactly. Exactly.
The
You could
question
have-
is, would something like that be allowed in the current zone?
Yeah.
So all of our commercial districts, well, virtually, nothing's ever 100%. Virtually all of our urban commercial districts allow what we call commercial services studios of the following types: art, craft, dance, music, and photography. So the idea of the you know, you come in for lessons,
Right.
those sort of painting or ceramic type studios now that people do with their kids or their, you know, for birthday parties or girls' night out or whatever it is, those would be permitted.
Yeah.
As
So what we're
opposed to some
imagining is
sort of a
already permitted.
production facility where you are like, you've got sort of this industrial glass blowing space and then a gallery. I think at some point you're going to cross that line where you've become manufacturing. And the question is, are we comfortable with where that is currently?
Something like making jewelry, taking raw material like some metals or whatever, and then producing some jewelry or something like that. That would be permissible?
I mean, I see, because it's described as a commercial service, I think this really is more of the, we're providing the lessons or we're providing the experience as opposed to manufacturing the
actually creating the
product
goods.
to retail. And
But
so I think that's
A
really
brew
the question.
pub is not providing a service, they're manufacturing a product to sell. So that's,
Right.
they're.
And that's a consumable, right? Wasn't that the distinction you were suggesting?
Yeah, that's what
Consumables?
Glenn was mentioning. And you can clearly do food and beverage service in these zones so that you can have a brew pub. And we've certainly said, well, if you have a restaurant, you are clearly to some degree manufacturing some food, right? To serve to the people sitting there. We're not splitting hairs to that degree. But this is the idea of, I'm not only going to manufacture food to serve in my restaurant, I am also going to bake bread or brew beer or make wine to sell to new seasons. And that's the piece that's missing in these zones. And in the community commercial that we're hearing, they may not be able to make a brew pub work if they can't also have this other element. They might need that component, and we'd like to be, at least the Oak Grove folks are interested in providing that opportunity.
Would there be I'm just curious, would there be a size restriction? Because you could see a brew pub, and all of a sudden they take off, and they're the next greatest thing in the metro area, and all of a sudden now they need to expand, and so I could see where that could present a potential challenge.
And I brought this point up with the representatives of Oak Grove. Would they advocate for, a square footage limitation on the facility or a minimum lot size? And at least in the consideration of the available sites in Oak Grove, they felt like it wasn't necessary because the available property size is already so small that it would constrain something from being too large. So that was some feedback, but we've not done an individual, site consideration.
Well, the reason I'm saying is like, okay, that may work there, but take the one out by my place in Sunnyside. So as is this strip mall, these businesses vacate, real easy for this business to continue to expand. And at some point, maybe they have the whole damn shopping center for their brewing operation, over time. So I guess you'd want to think about any unintended consequences and how those might get addressed.
Yeah, and I think we're definitely going to have to craft some, we're going to have to think about how we craft the language to require the retail component. Because you could have something very simple that just says you're required to have a retail component.
Yeah.
But you're going to get into this. I can just picture the conversations now at the counter. Well, if I sell 3 beers a week, again, I don't think in these locations that's likely what we're going to attract.
No.
But I think we'll want to have something that's a little more specific about how much of the use needs to be retailing, whether that's a square footage standard, and we kind of need to talk through how that might work. And so potentially, if you require that balance, you might prevent the manufacturing piece from getting too big just based upon what you require for the retail component.
So what if you required it as a secondary use, right? So what if you said something like, we would prohibit or we would allow manufacturing of consumer and artistic goods as a secondary use of an existing retail or restaurant establishment? Because I think if it's secondary to the retail, that puts a restriction on it in terms of size, right? You couldn't have your brewery being twice as big as your restaurant.
Rogue Brewery in
Well,
Newport.
what is the definition of secondary? Is it 50%, 60%, what?
And is
I
there a
mean, is it-
definition?
It's not the primary purpose of the business. The primary is retail.
And is there a definition in the code between retail and wholesale for?
I can't remember. I believe we have actually defined that. If we haven't, we do very clearly understand the distinction that when you're retailing, you're selling to the end user. And when you're wholesaling, you're the middleman. So it's going maybe from the manufacturer and then you're going to sell it to the retailer, but not to the end user. So I think that part's pretty clear. Our code has certain categories of uses, and I would like to try to find a way to fit this within a framework we already have. So uses are either conditional, and I don't think we're talking about a conditional use process here, or they are primary, accessory, or limited. So primary is the main use on the lot, right? And it doesn't require a conditional use permit. Accessory is something that is sort of incidental to, subordinate to the main use. So that's the fact that you can have a playhouse for your kid, but your house is the primary use, right? And the, backyard play area is accessory. And then limited, we don't have those in all zones. We do in some of our multifamily and commercial zones, and that does tend to be a square footage control. And I believe in most cases, where it'll be like, well, it's primarily multifamily, but you could have up to 15% of your square footage be retail, for example. So we have that model. I don't know if this lends itself to a square footage breakdown. I mean, I'm kind of struggling with, but then if we don't do that, what's the alternative? Is it, then it's like you're starting to talk about the dollar value of what money, and I think that gets really hard. It's like we can go down the rabbit hole really fast.
But also to argue that it should be an accessory use almost defeats the purpose of what they're trying to do, which is it really complements it. It's not necessarily, it's not accessory. It's more than that, right?
Well, if you had a coffee roasting business, you would have a 20 by 20 storefront in the front of the place and probably you could have something 80 feet deep in the back to roast your coffee.
Right.
Because of all the different blends you have and packaging and whatever.
I mean, we could look at, again, we're not, although Oak Grove brought this to us and we certainly want their feedback, and I'm sure you will hear from them as this moves forward. There's not the only neighborhood this is going to apply in. So I think we can explore some options for looking at potentially like an upper limit on the manufacturing square footage, something that seems reasonable in an, kind of urban mixed use environment, but still, we might even have a model for it in our mixed use zone we can look at. And then some sort of requirement for this is more than just a nominal retail, that you do in fact have something that's significant, and we can bring you some
Jennifer,
options.
are you saying that secondary doesn't exist as an option?
That's not
You
a
have to
use
define it.
category we
Yeah.
currently have. I mean, we
Yeah.
could write some language to say
Right.
anything, but the more discretionary the language becomes, then the harder it is to do just like one tenant switching out for another one, because you start to get into this question of, do I need to put you through a land use application, to swap out a tenant? I'd like to try to be more clear and objective about this if we can.
Is there any examples from some of the cities that we could use? I mean, I was just at a brew pub
might
just
be.
down the street here a few weeks ago, just tiny little place. And then, obviously the city of Portland is full of them.
Yeah.
And they're all over the place. So it seemed like there might be some opportunities to kind of see how other municipalities have addressed the issue in a way to,
We can do that.
it seemed like that.
Does the state identify light manufacturing versus?
I don't think there's not, there's maybe some sort of general understanding about the difference between light and heavy industrial, but that's not, our code doesn't really define that. So just being kind of conscious of the time and that we have like 7 more of these to work through, plus mining to talk about. How about if we just commit that we'll be back sometime in January to talk to you about both kennels and this with some options. But what I'm
makes
not
sense.
hearing anybody say they don't want to provide a pathway for this. It's just what it looks like.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
I think that's right.
Great.
Thank you. The notice radius topic, when this was considered for the work program, as I understand it, the Planning Commission didn't recommend that we modify the noticing radius of certain land use applications, but the board added it to the work program. So that's why we're doing it here today. And indeed, whatever you might think about it, we might come with proposals to amend the code anyway before you, and you can say what you think about it then. But we did a little number crunching. The specific interest of the board was to look at increasing the notice radius for rural areas. So right now for land use applications in the ag, forest, EFU, and timber zones, we notify property owners within 750 feet. And then in other rural areas, this is all outside of UGBs, it's 500 feet. So I just crunched the numbers. These are rough numbers, and they're based on just a sampling of land use applications that we made last year. And we extrapolated those out based on the number of application types in a given year. And we figured that it could cost upwards of these amounts listed on the screen in your packet for increasing the notice radius just of the natural resource zones, the ag, forest, EFU, and timber zone. Increasing it 1,000 feet might cost us $2,500 additional every year in the postage, the number of additional copies of paper sent out, all of that. A quarter mile might be a little bit more than $7,000 extra per year in costs. And then a half mile might be something like almost $40,000. Now, if we were to throw in the mix, increasing the notice radius of not just the natural resource zones, but these other rural areas outside of urban growth boundaries, the cost would be even more. And they're on your screen. They're just estimates, but they give you a good sense of what additional costs the division might see.
Right.
Do you have any feedback?
I'll jump in on this one. And I apologize, I was feeding my daughter mac and cheese for dinner, and I had a lot of time to think about this
Cool.
one. So first of all, being a rural resident, I've long been an advocate for expanding this, and I was pretty big on that hearing, and I think you guys talked me out of it, and I'm glad that the county commissioners saw the light on this one. But forgive me, I've got a harebrained idea that I recognize hasn't been fully thought through, and it may be difficult to manage, but I'll draw you a little chart here. So say this is your subject property, you've got this area around it, you've got roads crossing, right? The property over here might not care less what's happening, even they're inside that zone, but the people up and down that frontage road do. They're the ones that are driving past this every day and are affected by the traffic and whatnot. So I wonder whether there's actually a way to have a smaller zone around that piece of property, but be notifying the people up and down that frontage road that are actually going to be seeing it and have a higher degree of impact.
You want linear notice instead of radial
Yeah, it
notice?
seems to make more sense to me, right? In the rural area where if you're 2 streets over, and I'm not visualizing the distance, right? You might not, it's out of sight, out of mind, but when you're driving past this whatever it is every day, that's, I think, the people who are more likely to be impacted by it in a rural area. I don't know.
And
Throwing that out there as something to think about.
I see it more as with the larger acreages, like the timber and the ag, going out, a quarter mile is nothing. I mean,
Right.
properties are half a mile by a mile wide. So,
people get notified
you
and
don't
the
get
rest of the people
notified
down the
because
street
everybody's
don't.
on, hundreds of acres. But on the smaller rural, which we're talking like the RFF5, then maybe, your idea makes more sense. But with the really large wildernessy areas, I would opt for the quarter mile. But then that's too expensive to go out with all those other zones, making
But
the
I'm going
bill
to
too
push back
high.
on that because we do that for the heavily populated areas, and they get all kinds of notice all the time, but we don't want to spend money on people who live in our, outskirt areas. At the end of the day, these numbers are pretty small in the broad county's budget.
Let me ask
And it's
you,
about public
I have a question
participation.
here. Who pays for this now? The county?
Your budget, right?
Yeah, I mean, the county pays for the notice, but in a sense, but we charge application fees. We don't charge typically, and we're trying to gather better data right now, but I'll just say as a general premise, we do not recover all of our costs. So our application fees are not set high enough to recover everything it costs to process. And that has been a conscious decision, I'm not saying by the current board, but over the years, a conscious decision that there's a public benefit to land use planning. And so that should be split, where the general fund, meaning the general taxpayer dollars, pay for part of what we do, and the actual applicant who stands to benefit from the development pays for part of it. And those percentages have been different, and it's been a long time since we've done a big fee study to really look at where we stand right now. In theory, if you decided, or ultimately the board decides to do this, then yes, our fees could be increased to capture this cost. What that means for every individual application, I mean, we haven't done that math, and it's obviously going to depend on where it gets settled. I think, generally, again, because of consistency, I went into this project thinking we want one notice radius per geographic, based on zoning, which is what we do now, because it's easiest for my permit specialists to
Right.
figure out,
Yeah,
right?
I get
Not, it's just, you go in, you tell the computer to buffer out a certain distance, it makes this circle from the perimeter of the property, and you send notice. I'm not saying it couldn't be changed to something, it's gonna have to be a combination, because state law requires the radius. We already notify in most cases, not all cases, in most cases, we notify more than the state minimums already in our code, and we at least meet the minimums in all cases. So we would have to continue to do that, and so it would end up being a combination of a radius and some sort of linear, and I'm already imagining all the circumstances, well, where it's a flag lot, and so there would be a lot of complexity to that. Not saying it's impossible, but there'd be some complexity.
But the bigger point is, our job here is to figure out how to notify the people who are interested in projects and might be impacted by them, right? So we should be thinking about who those people are and figuring out how to design the system to contact those people, rather than just creating a random, deciding on a number.
Yeah, one thing I guess I want to throw out, because I started out thinking, well, I don't want to start talking about which types of applications we notify differently, because again, then something's going to get missed.
Right.
But I do wonder, because our high volume applications are the ones that tend to be less controversial. We don't get hundreds of conditional use permits every year. We don't get hundreds of zone changes every year. What we get is something like 100 temporary dwellings for care, where they're putting a mobile home on a piece of property for a relative to live in. That may make the neighbor concerned, but they probably don't care a half a mile away whether a mobile home is going in. A home-based business that is pretty tightly controlled in terms of impact, there's a traffic cap, et cetera. Again, do we need to notify half a mile? And those are the ones that we tend to have most applications on. A 2-lot partition in the rural area, do they care a half a mile away? I don't know. So it might be that looking at these costs, we think about, well, maybe it's those applications that are what we call our type 3 applications, which are zone changes, conditional use permits, large subdivisions, the things that tend to generate those greater impacts and those greater concerns. And if we split it that way, then at least it's something where I think we can track it. Like we can say, if it's a conditional use permit, we're going to double our notice radius, or whatever it turns out to be. So I guess something for you to think about is, do we think we need to notify about everything, or are there certain types of applications that tend to have more community impact that we should be concerned about?
Right. Can I say? And I think why the BCC has brought this to us, or brought it up, is I've heard this like a lot in our CPO leaders meetings. This is getting complained about really consistently on our quarterly meetings. And that was one of the things I was going to bring up, Jennifer, was the type apps. Where I'm at, home occupations, temporary homes, no, we're completely fine with the process today. It's the solar farms, it's the conditional use, it's the non-conforming, all of those definitely need the wider, and that's what we're also hearing at the leaders meetings. But another real huge factor that I don't know that we're factoring in here is that we have like 37 CPOs, and 1/3 of them are inactive. So you don't have a group of people that are listening, watching, connected, notifying. It's what I
Which
spend.
makes this notice really important.
It's vital. And when you don't have the CPOs, where we reach out extensively with bulletins and reader boards, and websites when anything as chair, I know what to do. I know, where it's gonna flare up. And I go out and really market it so that people get to the CPO meetings and they really have knowledgeable, experienced representation at the county level. And that's where these balls are really getting dropped, is we don't have that. And I really would like to push toward getting those 11 CPOs active.
Is notice permissive for you guys? If you know something is gonna flare up, if you know it's gonna be controversial, are you able to choose to expand notice in a way that's responsive to what, based on your experience, people will be dissatisfied if they're not given substantial notice?
So, I don't believe that we're legally prevented from doing that. I mean, that notice is a minimum, and it isn't that you can't go beyond. I do think I would want to talk to legal about that, because there would be some concern if it was perceived that we were picking on certain applicants. Essentially, like, we've identified your application as controversial, therefore we're going to go out and try to drum up opposition to it. I would never want to be in that position. I would prefer that we have a set
Consistency.
And that's the CPO's
Yeah.
job. That's not the county's job.
But for an additional question there, though, based on the county, for those areas that don't have CPOs or everybody else, as it relates to the cost and your approach, I mean, if you have a consistent area regardless, and you do it by type of application or however this group recommends at this point, do you also consistently make sure that there's electronic notice that doesn't drive costs like this? Or do you have avenues for adequate electronic notice?
So we could pursue that. We actually talked about that when this came up at the work program discussion last spring. That was where this group ended up, was we need to have a discussion about sort of modernizing our notification system, because really we're getting to the point where, do people really want to get the envelope in the mail with 2 pages of paper in it? How many people are just tossing it versus
there's
actually
Twitter
looking
and
at it?
Facebook
And there may
and-
be better ways to do it.
Yeah.
And so we were going to talk with our public and government affairs people and think about, because they are using social media. They're using, Nextdoor and Facebook and Twitter, and we have a website. We use it for some things. We don't post everything, but we post hearing items. But then people would have to know to go check that, as opposed to if they've just choose to sign up for the county feed of whatever, then they'll get that.
But next door would
we
be
could
you
do more
guys
of it.
knowing the neighborhood.
Yeah, and
choosing
our
to post.
PGA folks do, but at the moment they're not pushing those out for 600 applications. It probably wouldn't really be
Right.
600, but
Part of,
maybe
you know,
400.
Any small business owner nowadays will tell you that about this fallacy of relying on these third-party Facebook and Nextdoor forums, because you don't actually own any of the data. And I really think, wish the county would put some more focus on developing its own email list, creating a sign up for alerts on things. And because to the extent it exists, it's not very well promoted. And if we actually had our own list, it would solve a lot of these problems. Because right now, we're relying on Nextdoor and Facebook to get the word out.
Yeah,
which
they
is
do
crazy.
have I forget, it's like eGov delivery. I mean, there's something, I can't remember the name of the
Yeah.
program, but there is a way, but like you're saying, it doesn't mean people know about it. You
Right.
can go in and you can check the boxes of all the things you're interested in. And at the moment, in the land use world, you're going to get things like, we're doing a short-term rental project, or we're looking for feedback on our work program. You're not going to
Not
get
getting notices by zip code.
individual
Right.
land use applications, and it's
Yeah.
not targeted by your. So is there more that could be done? Yes, potentially, and we committed to have that conversation, but the board wanted to still pursue this discussion, and so that's where we are right now.
Well, I can see definitely needs in other fields for this contact information, either by a text message or something that could alert people individually. In our neighborhood last week, they burned the Boomer 2 timber sale that they cut last year. They had the state permission, they had the right weather conditions. They set off burn piles above Timberline Rim neighborhood. At night when we were coming home, I thought the whole hillside was on fire, and there was no notice to the neighborhood that they were doing this. And this was a very scary situation. So I had a chat with Timber, I had a chat with disaster management, that there should have been at least an alert to some of the community leaders to please inform us that this was happening. So
I really think this should be part of the staff and the commission's recommendation, like spending some money on an electronic resource now is going to save us a ton of money in the long run.
I agree.
Well, we can see it right there. I mean, seriously, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And it's the wave of the future. We've got to be able to reach out to get to this because
right.
this is not working. And I had the same, I mean, I had 3 separate fire stations at my property when we did slash burning. And we knew for a month we had the permits to do it. So there's got to be not just emergency, but also county.
Some sort of communication
Definitely.
structure for rural
So maybe
part of
for
the county.
purposes of right now, if you could come to a consensus on, I'm certainly not hearing you want to abandon this idea.
Right.
So if you could come to consensus on what distance you would like us to actually draft. So, because we need to do a proposal to begin with. So which distance do you like? And then this whole question of when your recommendation goes, supplementing it with,
Right.
hey, if this cost is too high, we could look at linear. We could look at only notifying certain kinds of applications. We could look at, this electronic system and sort of this almost tiered recommendation to them of all the different things we could do.
Right. So when you ran these numbers, I assume you ran them for all of the notices you would plan to provide, right? Tier 1, 2, Tier 3.
The applications that have public notice, which are
Right.
typed 2 and 3, you extrapolate that all, right?
And so I really like the idea, actually. I agree with you that the smaller level applications do not need a half
No.
mile notice. But the Tier 3 ones, I think if we significantly expanded those to, you could push that out a half mile and the numbers are still going to be nowhere near what that is because it's not going
Correct.
out for every application.
Yeah, and while I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, just seeing the full list of how many applications went out in 2018, the majority of them were home occupations, short-term rentals, and partitions.
And I think you're right. Most people are not, the neighbors are going to care about that. And our current noticing process is getting those people. It's the bigger applications. And I think if we did a serious, significant expansion, and you can still do a radius, I think, in that case, because if you're pushing it that far out, and you just did it for the Tier 3s, I actually think that solves most of our problem.
And I might just throw in the mix that right now in the natural resource zones, ag, forest, EFU, and timber, on average, it's something, just recalling off the top of my head, between 20 and 30 average property owners that are noticed based on the current 750-foot distance.
Yeah, it's more than you think. Because again, the areas that are the most remote don't have that many applications. I mean, that's part of it too. There's not that much
Right.
going on in those areas, so,
Right.
Do we ever
A lot
use
of-
temporary signage?
have we?
Yes.
Years ago, also before my time, they did require property posting the way that some cities still do. And I think the issue is the geography that we're dealing with is challenging. And enforcing it becomes, it's not like, oh, hey, I'm at the city planning department and I can just go, half a mile from the office and figure out if they took the sign down. It's, oh, well, they said they took the sign down and now I got to drive out to, and the vandalism
reality is,
element
I think the
and all that.
signage works a lot better in a more urban setting. Out in rural, people are driving past those signs and you're not reading them
Too
anyway.
fast, and then, and then they,
You're not walking
whatever,
down sidewalks.
you're into this. It blew down, my neighbor stole it, kids came by, and I think that's probably why, but it's been at least 25 years since we required posting.
I think you need to look at increasing the fees for the applicant, particularly in those, what do you call them, Tier 3?
They're pretty high. Some of them are
Some of
real
them
high,
are.
Well,
non-conforming
they-
and
But they're
conditional.
probably making money off of it too, so.
True.
I think
If they want it bad enough, they'll pay for it.
you guys know the data better than we do, right? So I think maybe half mile is too much. What we have now is probably not enough. So somewhere in between there is probably where we need to fall.
800 feet.
I like quarter mile for the Tier 3 myself, but
I also like your road idea, Brian. I really do. I think, some of those
Those are the
resident,
people that are
the
impacted. by
linear,
it.
is that what you
I
called
just
it?
don't know
Yeah.
how hard it would be to actually implement it from a staff perspective.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I hear that problem, but I do think that, it's the people that are driving past it every day that really care about some of these issues.
Yeah, I'm thinking about some of our worst, and some of them were this driving by versus just neighborhood stuff.
You can live a half mile away and still be impacted
Yeah.
by, if you're walking down the neighborhood trail or whatever it is, the half mile is close enough to be impacted by these things.
But I still think yours works better for the small, zonings with the small acreages. And when you got the big acreages, hundreds if not thousands of acres and large expanses, that driving thing doesn't work
Right.
for those.
Yeah.
If it's helpful, we can kind of put together some more information about that idea.
And you've got a
And
little
propose
bit of
it.
direction from us now.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
yeah.
This next
Martha.
option is proposed by representatives of a development review committee and by the county's transportation engineering division and by planning staff as well. It relates to fee in lieu of the construction of frontage improvements on streets for certain types of development. Right now, the zoning and development ordinance allows developers under certain circumstances to pay for frontage improvements instead of actually constructing them. There are instances where it's a partition but not a subdivision, and certain new residential units. So not large apartment complexes, but maybe a duplex. So in these certain types of development in certain areas, somebody can pay a fee instead of the frontage improvement requirements. And these staff from other groups are proposing changes to the rules. So right now, FILO can be paid for required frontage improvements, so sidewalks, et cetera, when the development is on a local connector or collector street, but not on any other street type like an arterial. And this is all only in the case of the Portland Metro UGB. It's also already the case that the FILO requirements can be paid only if the frontage improvement requirements are on this essential pedestrian network, and that the county's engineering team finds that paying FILO instead of actually building the sidewalks would be a, quote, acceptable alternative. So it's kind of a vague concept. Alternatively, if the frontage improvement requirements that are required are not on the essential pedestrian network, let's see.
On the EPN was the exception.
Oh, I'm
Is
sorry.
that right?
If it is on the EPN, rather, thank you, then you can only pay FILO for the requirements if there are one of specific defined criteria met. For example, the property where the sidewalk would go has some topographic constraints or that would essentially make having a sidewalk there useless. They could pay a fee instead of doing that. What these staff have recommended is that we change the rules in two ways. That FILO could be paid for required frontage improvements no matter what the adjacent street classification is. So even on arterials, for example. And also that we would expand the list of qualifying cases under which FILO could be paid. So for example, maybe there's an instance where there are drainage constraints that a sidewalk would create. Well, the proposal is to allow a developer to pay FILO in those instances instead of building this potentially problematic sidewalk. And finally would be to have the same list, expanded list of qualifying cases apply to all situations regardless of whether or not the frontage improvement requirements are on this essential pedestrian network or not. Basically just make it all the same within the Portland Metro UGB.
Is there a positive or negative or neutral impact financially to the county with these changes?
Gosh, I wouldn't know that answer off the top of my head. Karen Bjerg is sitting in the audience. I don't know if she knows off the top of her head too. But it would practically allow the county to collect more in revenue and choose where it spends this FILO money on. The FILO fees can't just be spent on anything. The code requires that it be spent on certain frontage improvement requirements and walkability improvement requirements within the UGB. So it might make more funds available.
So if I could ask a question then. So what that means is it goes into a pot. The county can choose to spend it wherever they choose. So theoretically, you could have a development in one area, collect all this money, and the money's used to make improvements in another area in the county. Is that true?
Correct. Or in a related sense, maybe that sidewalk is really needed, but it's too costly to make it happen. It costs the developer more to put that sidewalk in than it does to pay the fees, and therefore
They're off the hook.
They're off the hook, and a necessary amenity never gets built.
I mean, I guess that would be my
Sort of.
concern, is it,
So, I'll just add, this is Karen Burek, Long Range Planning Manager. So the requirements related to philo have been in place since I'd say about 2005, 2006 around.
Yeah.
And the intent was to, address the fact that there were definitely places in the county where there were no other sidewalks. And that by requiring the sidewalk, it wouldn't connect to anything and really wouldn't be used very much. While at the same time, there was this contribution of pedestrians to the area. So the intent was to be able to say, okay, there are certain places where sidewalks don't necessarily need to be built, but we do have other places where they do need to be built. So it allowed for the collection of some funds. And some examples of where we have constructed sidewalks is recently on Torbank, which connects to Oak Grove Elementary School. That's a sidewalk that was built from River Road to the school using these philo funds that wouldn't have been able to be constructed otherwise. The development review team has found that there have been instances. I think one of the things that has spurred this is this restriction of not being able to collect the funds on arterial roads. We can't collect the funds on arterial roads, and we also can't expend the funds on arterial roads. And the initial thought when we were doing these requirements was the arterial roads is where we need the sidewalks. And so if there's going to be a development, we want a sidewalk built. I do think that the development review team has found that there are instances where and especially around stormwater drainage, where it just isn't, I don't know if it's quite financially feasible, but it really adds an extensive amount of cost for the benefit that you get from getting that small amount of sidewalk. And so I will take River Road, for example, where the pattern of building the sidewalk isn't there. There's some other, they have wider shoulders and whatnot. And there have been some instances where they have, where it may have been appropriate to say, here you can pay philo because there's not sidewalk connecting, but they haven't had that ability. So the intent was to say, okay, perhaps there's more qualification cases that we can put to be able to allow someone to request philo, but still be able to require it when needed. So it still would be required if there were sidewalks within 200 feet or other specific requirements. So this is kind of a fine tuning, really, of how philo is being applied.
well, I mean, I kind of understand the dilemma. You'll have a development and all the adjacent property, there's no sidewalks, but because all of a sudden you're going to develop this property, now you have to put the sidewalk in. So the sidewalk will never, ever happen.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
The sidewalk will never happen because the other properties never get developed. And so that money goes to build a sidewalk somewhere else. So the question I would ask is, is there any attempt to recognize that, there still needs to be a sidewalk there? It's just the system doesn't necessarily allow it to get built because it's dependent on someone developing that property before anything gets done. So is there a process where there's an identified need for areas and then, as fields come within a region, it helps then address those specific areas as opposed to just going into a general fund and then it just kind of depends on where in the county someone wants to put a sidewalk. It just seems like there's a potential equity issue here that is a concern for me.
And will you define, because I don't remember the classifications of the different roads, give us a couple examples of arterials,
Arterials?
please.
So River Road is an arterial.
Okay.
Oatfield is an arterial.
Okay.
I believe Thiessen, that goes east-west.
Is
That's an-
Beavercreek Road?
So Beavercreek Road is an arterial. We are talking, this is applied within the urban growth boundary. So outside of the urban growth boundary, this wouldn't be applicable.
So following up on
Thank
what
you.
Tom was saying, okay, so we get this philo, and eventually the two properties on the other side are developed, and they put the sidewalks in, and now we've got this chunk in the middle that doesn't have a sidewalk. The money has been paid and used somewhere else. Who's going to pay for that sidewalk? That little chunk in between?
I think our experience is that doesn't happen very often. I'm not saying it couldn't, but what typically happens is that there either isn't, I mean, often there isn't any development potential on either side because you just happen to have this one oversized lot that's able to redevelop and it's just an infill piece. And so we were getting, I think, these sidewalks to nowhere, quite honestly. And so what we hear from developers is, are you kidding me? I have to go out there and spend this much money and build this sidewalk that doesn't connect to anything. And they would just as soon pay the fee. Now, the way this works, it is the developer's option. So if they want to build, they can. If they want the investment on their site, that is their choice. But oftentimes, I think that our experience is they would rather pay the fee than put in a piece of sidewalk that doesn't go to anywhere.
Well,
But you
they'd rather
could
pay
have
the-
your situation that you're describing. It could theoretically happen that way.
I'd rather pay the fee because I assume the fee is less than it would actually cost to build a sidewalk.
They're using an engineer's estimate now, aren't they?
They
It was a
recently-
flat
yes.
fee, but I don't think it is anymore.
They recently changed what they.
Yeah, I
how
think they have to give
calculated
an
the fee.
estimate that includes everything. I can
And-
tell you.
You brought up stormwater issues, could be a factor in this. Is the county using green stormwater control by using like gravel-based man-made wetlands to absorb?
You
on
know,
site?
I think it depends probably in what stormwater district you're in, who actually is making those requirements, but I don't know specifically, but we have like the Oak Lodge Water District that has certain requirements, or Water Environment Services that may have certain requirements. I do know that we have worked with our road department on looking at different types of swales and where those can be implemented, but that really depends upon the soil types that are there and the drainage amounts and whatnot. So one of the things that I was, Glenn, can you remind us what specific applications? This philo is not permitted for a subdivision. It's not for the very large applications. It really is for the partition. I believe perhaps duplexes, but it's really the very small applications that are in there. So that addresses a little bit this concept of being able to get those larger pieces of the sidewalk. I think the other thing, and the piece with regards to the Central Pedestrian Network has served in the past that purpose of identifying the most important roads for us to be achieving sidewalks on. That has been a place that we have used as a guide to be able to say, these are the places where there are attractors or create connections, because in the past, every single road, not everyone will be walking on it that same rate. So we have really used that and in the past to help us know which sidewalks or which areas are most likely to be used for walking. I think, though, with this change, the development review team was really wanting to have a clear set of potential reasons why a philo would be granted, and use those everywhere versus just in one, and just some requirements for the essential pedestrian network and others for not the essential pedestrian network.
Clarifying question, on the philo fees, will those fees be spent in the UGB areas only?
Yes.
So that way, at least it's restricted that way? And then, K through 5, it's a 1 mile walk zone around schools, and 6 through 12, it's a 1.5 miles. So, do we have anything in our guidance to basically say, if you're doing the development, you will be doing sidewalks, at least on one side of the road, so we have a safe path to the schools?
So we do not have off-site sidewalk requirements. So if you're building, if you're doing a construction, we're not requiring you to build a connecting sidewalk to a school. Is
Yeah,
that what you were?
well, I mean, because there's something, the Safe Pathways to Schools, there's an organization.
Schools.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so and there's funding that goes
Right,
around.
so,
that.
so we do have, action plans for those schools, and we may apply for outside funding to build those sidewalks, but, we're not gonna require an individual developer to build an off-site sidewalk.
Okay. I'm just thinking, if the neighborhood is inside a walk zone going to schools, I'm thinking, by default, my brain's saying they need to be doing sidewalks for the students who are not going to be bused.
Karen,
You're saying no
Karen-
philo within the walk zone.
Correct.
Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, and Karen, you're actually saying too that people in residential developments aren't even eligible for this program, if I understood correctly.
No, I think what I had said,
Ones are.
Oh, some are.
Yeah, no
yes,
subdivisions.
no subdivisions, like
Oh,
a
gotcha.
very large subdivision that would
Large
come in.
subdivision would not be.
But if someone did a partition, yes, they
Right,
could potentially
okay.
pay a philo.
This program to me just seems kind of reasonable. Like it seems flexible and responsive, and I would think that most people who are developing, if whoever they're developing for would benefit from the sidewalk, that they would build the sidewalk. But if the sidewalk is an island unto itself, they might consider paying the fee. I mean, it seems to me like this is responsive and flexible. I mean, this sounds pretty reasonable to me.
So I have a sense that we need two things moving into the next round of this, right? Maybe some case studies of how this is actually applied on the ground. Because I see your point, but I also see the idea that, if there's truly a need there and we're allowing developers to opt out, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that nothing ever gets built where a need is, right? And I think, so, I think we need to understand a little more about how it's actually being applied and this idea of how are we deciding where these funds actually get spent? Is there a process for prioritizing? How does that work? And I think that would help us, at least it would help me get my head around whether this really makes sense or not.
I just really don't think that developers are going to not build a sidewalk if the development needs a sidewalk there, or if it benefits from the sidewalk.
The fee in lieu, I did check the code. It applies to partitions, so that's 2 or 3 lots being created. You might have one existing house already, and you're creating 1 or 2 additional buildable sites. It applies to duplexes and triplexes, just where you have like one duplex on a lot, not like a whole development of duplexes. And it applies to single-family dwellings. So we do now have we didn't used to, but for a number of years now, it's probably the same time actually that the philo was adopted, the county added a requirement for sidewalks when you build a single-family dwelling on an existing lot in the urban area. We did not used to do that. And so part of when we adopted the philo, we did them hand in hand. We said, now there's a sidewalk requirement for a single-family dwelling, and oh, by the way, you can pay the philo, the fee in lieu of, because again, we were going to be increasing those places where you would just have 75 feet of sidewalk in a neighborhood of nothing, of no other sidewalks, and that was the thinking. So that's it. It doesn't apply to commercial, industrial, big institutional uses that go in through a conditional use permit or 4 lots and above.
Thank you. I've made a note about that, of looking up some case studies, though, of how this is actually applied and some explanation of where those philo fees have been spent in the past, and that could inform some future discussion about it.
Okay, so the question is, poor Martha.
I'm enjoying the conversation. I'm having a really hard time not talking.
So we have wireless facilities. Is that the last piece?
No, there are a total of 11 topics. We got essentially 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 5 more.
So I think we need a 5-minute break,
Okay,
right? Okay.
Yes,
Let's do
please.
that. So,
sure.
thank you.
Yeah.
So so we all want to wrap this up. All right, I got the thumbs up, we can get started. So the goal here is we have like 4 or 5 more pieces to tackle. We are going to try and get this done by 9:15, and if we're not done by 9:15, we'll kind of delay it to another time. And at 9:15, at the latest, we'll go into Martha's presentation, and we should be able to get everybody out of here sooner rather than later. So take it away, Glenn.
Yeah, the next item on the list is related to a mandate in which we have some options. and this is for small-scale wireless facilities. So I mentioned that there's this new federal mandate that says we have to allow small wireless facilities, and those are things that are specifically defined. We have to allow them in public rights-of-way and on private property. Jurisdictions can continue to impose regulations on the appearance of those structures and the siting of them to some degree, to the extent that those regulations are, one, reasonable, two, that they are no more burdensome than we would place on the deployment of other utility infrastructure, and three, that the rules are objective and published in advance. And we're going to come back to those. So we have the opportunity to have some regulations on these devices that were mandated to allow in rights-of-way and on private property. What are these things, though? Well, small wireless facilities, and some of you may know more about this than me. I'm not all that technical at all, but here's what I can regurgitate. And on these slides are some photos that I've ripped off of other jurisdictions' considerations of this issue. So even this picture is from the city of Lake Oswego's consideration. We're talking about devices that are, as the name implies, relatively small. They're used for the short distance transmission of signals, and they are going to be less visually obtrusive than your traditional macro towers, the big cell towers that we're used to thinking of. These are smaller units, and they are going to help allow for this 5G technology that you might have heard about, because they will increase the capacity of cellular coverage. They'll increase the capacity of networks and increase the coverage of cellular service around.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Who's putting these up? Is it the big cellular carriers like Verizon, or
Yes.
individuals?
Yep, it's not individuals, it's cell phone service providers.
I guess my mic wasn't on, sorry. Do I need to ask that again? Okay.
It's a good question. So why they're needed? Well, the existing macro towers may not provide sufficient coverage to help out with new technology that's going to be increasingly reliant on better cell phone coverage, including 5G. And so there's this interest in making sure that local jurisdictions' regulations don't preclude this technology from being deployed. And the FCC says you have to allow this technology so that we can stay competitive with 5G technology development. I think I'd like to show you just some pictures of what these are so you can get a better idea. Here are some pictures of small wireless facilities on light poles. It's this type of thing that I think are going to be the most common and of most interest to cell phone service providers or wireless providers. That is devices that are in public rights-of-way, because that's where the need for coverage is most likely going to be the most. If you're thinking about technology for automated vehicles, for example, they're going to need to have some wireless coverage in public rights-of-way along streets. Small wireless facilities might also help for instances where there's coverage gaps in big buildings, but I'll talk about those too. So here's some pictures of wireless facilities on lamp posts. They're literally these devices that sit on top. These might be the antennas, and then in some cases there'll be a utility box even incorporated in the structure down below. And then the antenna itself is up above. Here's some photos of other small wireless facilities in public rights-of-way. They might be on utility posts like these antenna here, these box-like structures. They could hang from power lines like here, or attached to other infrastructure in a right-of-way. Here are some creative adaptations for wireless facility items. This box on top of this bus shelter is a wireless antenna. And this is not a mailbox. It's actually a disguised utility box for a small cell facility that's on this adjacent light pole. There might be some opportunities to screen devices on a light pole as well. Staff are proposing that the ZDO not regulate small wireless facilities at all in public rights of way. So the ZDO and planners would not individually assess these aesthetic criteria, for example. Instead, we're proposing that the deployment of these devices be regulated under the county's roadway standards. And so teams are looking at, well, what would be appropriate regulations for those in county rights of way? But we're still left with, well, what do we do about small wireless facilities that are not on street lamps, bus stations, outside of rights of way, but on private property? Well, keeping in mind, and I think that this is an important thing to think about with this issue, is that, again, likely, at least in the initial stages of this technology, the interest is going to be in having the antennas in public rights of way. That's where most of these are going to show up because of what they would be used for. But instances where they need to be on private property outside of a right of way will be for large facilities where there are many users, like a shopping mall. Or maybe the structure is so weather resistant that it stymies signals getting through the building. So putting a small wireless facility in a building like that might be necessary. So in many cases, when a small wireless facility is on private property and there's a need for it, they might actually be inside of the building. And here are some photos of that. They might be on a ceiling or they might be on a wall, actually inside. That will help with the coverage and the insulation troubles of the structure. Now, there may be instances, though, where you want to have small wireless facilities outside of the structure on private property. These are photos not in the United States, but just in India to show what some of these rudimentary devices might look like. But these are more likely what we would see here in the United States, where these antennae are affixed to commercial or industrial buildings, maybe on the side, and somewhat blended in. There may be less of a need, certainly in the immediate term, for small wireless facilities on residential structures, although that's probably not likely because, again, it's about increased coverage, number of users, buildings that are well insulated, and you can't get the coverage right there from adjacent rights of way.
I do have one in my house.
There you go. And I wonder if it looks anything like either of these two. Here's one going up on apparently an apartment building,
Yes, the brick one.
and then one on a residential roof.
It just sits on a shelf.
How big is it? Do you know? Okay, is it outside?
Probably 6 by 6.
It's
yeah,
inside?
And it requires a satellite feed and wireless.
Okay. I'm underscoring this point because we might be tempted to think about lots of regulations for these of how they appear on houses and everything, but we may face less urgency about that just simply because it's not part of the need for the technology, at least right at the moment.
We don't have any regulations really on the dishes for TVs.
Correct.
I mean, those are pretty,
Correct.
Are any antennas?
other utility boxes attached to anybody's house for any purpose.
Yeah.
Yep. And so there is this order, and the order is effective now. We have to allow these now when we don't necessarily have standards for what these might look like. We could think about some, but in addition to making sure that any restrictions on small wireless facilities meet these 3 criteria of the FCCs, that they're reasonable, no more burdensome, and published in advance, we also want to make sure for noticing requirements that we're not ending up being more restrictive than we would be for those units if they were put up today. So maybe some concerns that you all might have about putting these devices outside on private property, outside of rights of way, might be its color, specifically the color of the antennas, maybe flashing lights on these devices or decals or advertisements. Maybe you have concerns about the noise that could be generated from cooling system fans. These are types of impacts from these that other jurisdictions have crafted rules about. Other examples that I didn't list in the staff report are, well, it's possible, although maybe highly unlikely, at least in the immediate term, that somebody in a residential neighborhood might want to put up a small wireless facility simply on a pole in their yard. Not on the roof, not on the side of their house, but just on a pole. Maybe you're concerned about that, and maybe you want to have setback requirements that are equal to the height of the structure, for example. These are what other jurisdictions have spent a lot of time hashing through, and it may just not rise to the level of needing that sort of analysis here.
They could
But
put a dish right next to the road. I mean, really.
I think there should be a 200-foot setback, minimum 5 acres, and
Not
not
under
not
5
on a
acres.
nowhere near a dog kennel,
No,
right?
Color the flag, green
And a
only.
conditional use permit on top.
Why are people would be putting up on their houses?
that maybe their house is just in a coverage gap,
Yeah.
maybe because topography puts them in a coverage shadow of some kind, or
And then
maybe
we
their
pay-
house is just too well insulated.
You know, we got people putting solar panels, ADUs.
Yeah.
I think we got bigger fish to fry.
Oh, yeah.
To be really honest with you.
I would, one regulation on that,
Yeah.
one
so-
thing I would consider is not putting it on anything living, like a tree.
Okay.
I'll start with why. So people will, it's called a CPE, or client provided equipment. It'll go on somebody's house to actually receive the signal, like we do receive the satellite antenna. So on people's dwellings, having an antenna that picks up the carrier's frequencies, that will bring the broadband to your dwelling. I'm going to shift back into there's safety comes first in me, and aesthetics comes second. I saw the microcell versus the traditional cell tower. All the cell towers, traditional ones, have fiber optics pulled to them. That's going to be the distribution hubs to feed the microcells, because when we talk about the increased bandwidth that's going to take place at the microcells, it's going to be 50 times faster than existing. They have to push out from the traditional cell tower sites. But I'm hoping the county is also looking at the revenue possibility, because the telephone poles, which belong to the electrical company, there's a telecom space of 3 feet up in the poles just above the transformer level. And of course, the carriers will be doing master service agreements to rent that space and have microcells that are repeating there, but that's not going to cut it. They're going to be coming to the county and saying, we want to be on traffic lights, we want to be on lights. I hope we do not miss the opportunity to say, they can't exist without access to the county's assets. They cannot do 5G. And 5G is just a letter. It does not specify what it is. Just like 4G is actually called LTE, and LTE is long-term evolution. It has nothing to do with it. It's the 4th generation of wireless, 5th generation of wireless. So I hope the county looks at revenue, but also safety comes first. 5G does have some concerns about the radiation output at the tip of the antenna, and then the aesthetics. I do think we should have a uniform definition of, if it's on traffic lights, that it can't be distracting to cause people to be distracted.
So I just, it sounds like we might want to try to connect you with our folks working on this in engineering potentially. There's a new draft of the roadway standards that literally I just got sent a link yesterday. So I haven't looked at it. And one of the things that I believe they are trying to address in this draft is this regulation of these in the right of way. And so I think they have been looking at what other jurisdictions have done, because we really haven't had the staff to be able to devote to doing a full scale project. So we want to kind of borrow from people. And so I don't know exactly what they're considering, but
I'd be happy to learn
But-
and chime in, because
Yeah.
at first the carriers are going to, because the adoption rate just doesn't exist. There's like 2 cell phones that can do 5G. So what they're doing is they're pushing out as powerful as they can off the traditional towers. They just upgraded the software to do a different modulation. And these picocells or microcells, depends on what standards body you go to, they're going to start popping up to repeat the signal. And they have to receive the transmission to rebroadcast. So you're going to see it first around Timbers stadiums or Oregon Ducks, because the density is there. Because if you've ever been to a game, cell phones don't work. This will make it so they does work. And so But over the next, 5, 10 years, it's going to be big.
So the way I'm thinking about this is a small number of carriers, well-funded, experts in the field, going out to private people and or public and finding spots to put them. That doesn't worry me much. If we ever go down the line of consumers, individuals putting this on their property to enhance their coverage, like when I put my solar panels in the house, there was a building inspection and there was a registered electrician that handled that. Coming back to those safety issues, I wonder if there does need to be a set of standards versus a commercial application versus a potential private one. I don't know if we're going down that road or
And I'm not sure what we can do. So FCC Type 15 basically says that we have to accept interference. We don't have a choice. And so my house can interfere with your house, and there's no legal recourse between us. But there's license frequencies. License frequency would be what you're receiving, and then you're rebroadcasting something local to your property. And so, that just, they wouldn't be able to sell the product if it didn't meet the power.
What is the known safety concern? What is the
the
verified known safety concern?
There's always concerns when you talk about, people think wireless, and it truly is, it's pushing radiation. So the question is how much radiation? It's like 2.4 Wi-Fi is the same frequency we use in microwaves.
So I was just wondering from a land use perspective or planning perspective, what is the safety issue that would need to be regulated by, that Brian's referring to? Like, it's not gonna fall and hit somebody on the head.
I think the issue is electrical application to building, right? If something is not properly wired, it could be a fire hazard, that type of thing.
Do we do that now for a cable box or whatever?
Well, that's the question is there a difference, right?
Yeah.
You certainly do it on my solar panels,
Right,
right?
which are
And this is
different
probably
in,
somewhere in between those.
I was gonna say different in probably scale.
Right. And I don't know enough about this to know how big or small the scale is, right?
Okay.
So from our perspective, we wouldn't be, we can't, the field is occupied regarding things like structural permitting, electrical permitting, plumbing permitting. That's dealt with through the Oregon building codes, and that's pushed out through our county building department. So to the extent an electrical permit's required, it would be required no matter what we do, and we are not able to go into the code and say, oh, you need to get an electrical permit. It's gonna be dealt with. We could certainly get you information, but we would not be able to regulate that through zoning. And then my understanding, and obviously you're the expert in the room on this, but my understanding is we can't use the radio frequency concerns as any sort of grounds for denying. It's like there may be a safety concern, but we don't get to talk about that with land. From
We don't
land.
get,
We're preempted.
we don't get to talk about
Yeah.
the power.
Yeah.
Even though they're putting equipment up, I think we'll end up on county assets.
Yeah.
But we don't get to talk about the power output. So.
So I think,
it comes back
yeah.
to, if we're truly talking about, what I think we're all talking about is a small number of carriers trying to get this thing up and running, I don't think I don't see any concerns with this, right? I don't think there's any need to regulate.
So we're going to have, really the carriers, not disputing what people are saying here, but the carriers actually don't own the cell towers. American Tower owns all the towers in America. And so I would see that they're going to basically be the master contract, and then the carriers having a one-layer separation of responsibility. They then lease the Pico space from whoever will be doing the master leases, master agreements with the municipalities who have light poles and street lights that they're going to attach to. So I would be going to the aesthetics route. You just want it to be non-intrusive. Don't notice it. If we were in the Columbia Gorge, they would be saying, oh, it has to match the. You can't see it, but.
And maybe that's what we want to think about specifically, is that if we have concerns about the antenna or associated utility equipment making sure to blend in with whatever it's on, then we would want to craft some specific regulations where a developer knows what that means in advance. It might be something literal, like the antenna, if it's mounted on the side of a building, is painted the same color as the section of the building that it's on. It might be that wires that connect the antenna to the utility box are routed inside or otherwise painted the same color. It might be that it doesn't include any flashing lighting visible from the outside, to the extent that you're concerned about the obtrusiveness of these. But maybe you're not.
Well, I think from my perspective, all I've got to go on is a set of photos that you put
Yeah.
up here, right? And so I think it would be helpful to understand what the real scope of big versus small, what these things actually look like. Because I look at these pictures and I'm personally not concerned. If they all look like that, like you said, they're not any different than a satellite dish.
Oh,
Oh,
they're
I'd take
even
that over
better than a
satellite
satellite.
dish, yeah.
But if it's bigger than that, if we're talking about something else, I think that's what we don't fully understand.
So just to set the landscape for where we are now, we have a code section that deals with wireless telecommunication facilities, and these would fall under that, which is the reason we're proposing amendments, because as it stands now, doing a new wireless facility in our residential zones, for instance, and and some other ones requires a conditional use permit. Well, that will never meet the shot clocks, nor do we want to do a conditional use permit for the kinds of things that you were seeing in the pictures. And we right now, arguably, we regulate these in the right of way, and it poses problems on the land use front because you get into this, owners need to sign. Well, the owner technically of the road might technically be the person who's fronts it next door, even though the county generally controls all the utilities that go into the right of way. So you just end up with this mess of, it's not really workable. So our first thing is get us out of the business of regulating any of this stuff in rights of way and put that in the roadway standards. We can share that information with you, but that's kind of the easy piece. And then these can't be a conditional use. We need to make them into a type 1 review. And so really the only question then is, do you want any kind of aesthetics at all? And I think that's the sort of, maybe you want a little more information I'm hearing, because how bad could these be?
Right.
I mean, we're hearing 3 carriers. Martha and I were at a class or whatever, legal seminar on Friday, and they said 3 carriers in our area, all of whom have to be on separate poles because they cannot allegedly share with one another because of interference. Every 250, yeah, something like, I mean, these are going to be
Everywhere.
everywhere.
It's gonna be like being in New York and looking
Everywhere.
around for a Starbucks.
And so that's
Yes.
I think that's
And
the
cameras
aesthetic piece.
everywhere.
It's like, what if they
Yeah.
literally are, you've got them every 200 feet everywhere? So I think that's why some
Still smaller than
jurisdictions
utility
are
poles.
concerned.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
They're
Is,
still
I mean, a
smaller than
street
utility
light's
poles
still
and
way
street
bigger.
lights and,
Right.
yeah,
5G is
Street lights every 200 feet.
yeah.
5G is just the signal propagation it's not the same. I mean, it's not going to get through that wall. So you're going to have another one on that other side of the wall. And so, so it's going to be, you're going to turn everywhere and see them. So I'm going, since they're going to be on everything, make sure that we understand that. And they can be aesthetically
75
pleasing.
years minimum before it gets out to our place.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right.
But it doesn't
That being
require
said,
type 1 review. You're not saying it requires type 1 review.
No, we could just choose to say we're out, they're exempt. We could exempt the whole thing from the zoning code completely. Or we could exempt in the right of way and continue to regulate with a type 1 review, so we can't do notice and appeals and all that because we won't hit the time. But the only reason to do a type 1 review is if you want standards. If you don't want any standards, there's no point in having a permit.
I think out of an abundance of caution, since we don't know what these are, I don't think what, Glenn, you're proposing is unreasonable at all, right? That no flashing lights, those types of things are not intrusive, but at least would set a base standard. I think it's much easier to take those away down the road than it would be to actually put them in after we discovered there was a problem.
But do we know that if you say no flashing lights, that these don't somehow require a flashing light to operate? Like, I don't know anything about this stuff.
Right.
And saying that we should have particular design standards, which we view as aesthetics and maybe the industry doesn't, is a little problematic for me.
A blinking LED is certainly different than a floodlight flashing
Right.
on and off, right? I think that's what we're trying to,
But to your point, I don't think we know enough.
yeah, I think we need to know,
Yeah.
We have a thought about reaching out to some representatives of the industry in early January to talk to them about, well, what will these things actually look like in Clackamas County? Probably. Will they have flashing lights at all? Is it necessary to see them from the outside? And we can talk about
I would
that
imagine
more,
they would
but-
want to be doing a bulk permit as well, because if you're talking about, 250,000 units
Right.
installed,
Yeah.
I mean, they're going to say, here's our application and here's the dots. And best practices will be followed, because they're not going to want to do 250,000 applications.
Nor would we want to manage all those individually, right?
We're just taking it for granted that they won't be advertising on the side of it too.
Are we ready to move on to the next round?
We certainly can.
Still, all the advertising will be in the.
We're going to wrap this up in the next 7 minutes.
Okay. The next one is an option that the county has by new state legislation. HB 2469 gives the county the option of allowing what are called accessory forest worker dwellings, or that's what we're calling them. You might be familiar with accessory farm worker dwellings in the EFU zone. This is analogous to that, except it's in forest zones, ag, forest, and timber. It would, if the county wanted to do it, allow a relative who's assisting with defined forestry activities to live on the same property in a new accessory dwelling on the property. A property would only qualify if it's at least 80 acres, and the accessory forest worker dwelling has to be accessory to and within 200 feet of that existing lawfully established dwelling. There's some requirements related to wildfire hazard mitigation as well. We did just a real brief analysis of where these might show up if the county were to allow them on this map. A little bit hard to read, but what's important is just really the dots, the green dots that show the distribution of potentially qualifying properties. This is just a segment of the county, as you can tell, and the green dots are largely concentrated at the edge of the timber zoned areas and ag forest zone areas shown in green, and closer to the populated areas of the county. So the green dots show properties that are at least 80 acres. They're tax lots, not necessarily lot of record, but we'll assume that they're individual lots. And they're properties that also have a dwelling on them today. So they meet two of the requirements. There's less than 60 of them. And indeed, these 60 lots may not be even involved in any sort of forestry-related activity, or even need an extra house to house a relative. That's why
Have we ever
assume-
received a request for this in Clackamas County?
No, I'm not sure how many people are even aware of this as a new option, but it's something that the legislature now allows the county to permit if it wants to.
Will this require septic?
Yes.
Yeah, they'd have to meet all the normal requirements for a new dwelling. To answer your question, anecdotally, I would say yes, there have been people who have been interested in the possibility of having an accessory dwelling on forest land over the years, although I think sometimes that's probably been people who are operating farms on forest land,
Okay,
and
that-
they can't have the farm worker
And that
dwelling.
makes perfect sense. I mean, an agricultural worker building, I actually have one, and he sprays and he mows and he does all of my ag stuff. But as far as timber, this makes 0 sense. I mean, I harvested 300 acres. You harvest, you slash burn, you spray for invasive, you seed. All of it happens within 12 months. You wait 15 years, you do your pre-thinning, you wait another 40 years, and you harvest, and you do it all again. What are you going to do every day, 365 days a year? I have no concept unless you're harvesting by cutting one tree a day, which you would never do. So this makes like 0 sense
But
to me.
timberland takes a lot of management. I have timberland at almost 75 acres, so I don't qualify, but I need a crew of 20 working out there every day to keep it up. I mean, I don't have anybody working out there, but to keep the brush down and to thin and to do all the things that are required to actually have a viable stand of commercial timber at the end of 45 or 60 years, you need a big crew. I don't have any money to do that, but you do need people out there doing it.
That's one way. I mean, it is one way. Ours, we did all of what I said in 1 year. You spray, you reseed, and you're done. I mean, you're done. We have done nothing in 15 years except next year we'll do our 15-year pre-thin. I mean, the brush does grow, but then the trees grow and overshadow it. But I'm not riding my horse through it because it's got brush in it. So it's just this is not make sense to me unless you want timber like yours. It's probably like a lovely park, which.
Mine isn't because
Well,
it
but if
hasn't
you
been
had-
maintained.
if you
and
had a
so many
crew,
trees have
yeah.
died because the brush killed them all. So
Right.
and it kills them whether they're 1 foot tall or 25 or 30 feet tall. So yeah, I've lost most of my timber, but because of non-maintenance. So
Yeah.
I can see why people need to have workers housed, on the property. I mean, I can see it. I can't do it, but I can see why.
Interesting.
And if I may, the state legislation has some pretty broad terms of what the forestry work that these people are doing. If I could just read it, it talks about that this dwelling would be for a relative to live on the property and assist in the harvesting, processing, or replanting of forest products, or in the management, operation, planning, acquisition, or supervision of forest lots. So it might not necessarily be just like cleaning up the underbrush. It could potentially allow for somebody who's engaged in other broader activities of the forestry management operation.
So this person would have to be a relative?
Correct. Of somebody living in the existing primary dwelling on that same property.
And what type of a relative? Nephew, third cousin, fourth time removed, or whatever?
It's not that broad. It is defined. I don't know it off the top of my head, but it would not, I'm sure, allow for like second cousins.
And the dwelling is a fully functional residence?
Yep.
Now, why is this requirement for 200 feet in there?
Just the requirement the state adopted, saying if you want to allow this,
Why?
you have to be 200 feet.
Why? Why? If,
Dog kennel.
why does it have to be within 200 feet?
Presumably, not knowing, having looked in the history, but just to make sure that it is indeed accessory to this operation, and it's not just a separate dwelling unit at the clear end of another piece of property that doesn't have any relation to what's taking place in the owners of that primary dwelling.
But I
That's a
think the
guess.
200 feet would create problems for the septic. At least I know on my
Yeah.
property it'd be too close.
So it has to be accessory. They can't sell it. What's the downside of adding a second dwelling on an 80-acre parcel?
Footprint. It's footprint. There's no reason for a second home.
Fire hazard.
Yeah.
Man, I just know the amount of time it takes me to manage my 1 acre yard. I can't imagine
Right.
what it would take to manage 80 acres, right? So I kind of see where you're coming from, that of the use. And I just don't, I mean, we're talking 60 potential spots in the county, one extra dwelling, probably small on an 80-acre parcel. I just don't, I don't necessarily see the downside of allowing it. If people really think they need it, what's the harm?
One I can think of, and this is just a potential concern, that these aren't necessarily manufactured dwellings. They can be stick-built dwellings, but they're tied to these conditions. And, well, what if the forestry operation goes bottom up and they want to sell this property? Well, that second accessory dwelling may no longer be in compliance with the conditions of it being there and technically has to be removed. And that's a downside. And then maybe somebody accidentally buys it. This happens.
Did you say it has to be removed if it's no longer forest land in?
Wouldn't
In
necessarily have to be
operation?
removed, just nobody
You
can
said
live in it,
remove,
right?
like,
Well-
remove the home.
Well, I'd have to double check on whether I can't imagine the dwelling could be allowed to stay there unless it's serving an allowed use. And if it doesn't meet the conditions of approval, in this case, that it is housing a relative of somebody in the primary dwelling unit any longer, then it technically is in violation.
And what if the uncle passes away? Now the nephew has to move into the uncle's house and get rid of the
Yeah.
accessory because there's no other relative. This is a
Well,
crazy
This
law.
is the same issue that plays out with farm dwellings. It's the same
Yeah.
permission. I'm not saying, right, wrong, or indifferent. It does pose administrative challenges exactly as Glenn described because they are only approved for specific uses. And that's the only
Wow.
reason they get the second dwelling and everybody else doesn't. And so if they don't follow those rules, the house has to go away. Now, technically, they could probably tear down the first house, or they could remove the kitchen and turn it into a home office or something, but they would not be able to continue to use it as a dwelling. And we fight that with farm dwellings as
But
well.
the farm is not relative.
So it is an
We
admi-
have a farm, and for that accessory dwelling we have,
There's both for
Right.
farms. You can do
Right.
relative or non-relative. And
non-relative,
it's a
but
higher
not-
standard for the non-relative
Right.
than the relative.
right.
So I'm curious, what drove the need for this House bill? Do you know anything about it?
I was just looking it up because I.
What are they trying to fix? What's the
I know,
problem?
what are they
We could
trying to
look into
fix?
that a little bit more and try to understand what the history is.
My
It's been a long
suspicion is
time
there's somebody
from
specific
session,
who
and this
wanted
one
it.
There's only
did not rise.
58 parcels that are falling.
I know,
in this
but I mean,
category.
it's-
Why
it
are we
was-
worried about it?
Well, it's a
This
statewide
person
issue
is
for some
saying,
reason.
As
That's
a
why they
senior,
passed it.
as senior family members age, succession planning is a key element to keeping the land within the family. Allowing younger family members to build a second dwelling, to be involved in the day-to-day management, allows for them to seamlessly take over the property.
That's what's behind it.
That's what this says. It's just, I just randomly looked at a particular person in support of this legislation, what their witness testimony was. And from their perspective, this was all about succession planning for large lots.
Just seems like it would cause more problems than it would solve. I mean, I just see so many holes in this, but
But I do
I don't
think
know.
succession planning in ag generally is a problem.
I mean, my folks did
So,
the same thing, but it
yeah.
was about when we die, you take over, and then I did. So, I mean, it's
Right.
really working with a relative to,
don't know, guys.
interesting.
Yeah.
What is that bill number,
They
if
just
you don't
want,
mind?
they just don't want the kids to live with you,
Was that, or vice versa?
or vice
right?
versa. So you don't have to live with the
House Bill
kids.
2469.
My in-laws, but-
Forest template dwelling, would this interfere with that in any way, shape, or
No,
form?
it's just a different option.
Just a different option.
Yeah, there are
Right.
like 8 or 10 different ways to, but actually, I think there's more like 14 different ways to build a dwelling in farm zones. And now forest, we're up to, I don't know, 7 or 8. They just keep adding different alternatives.
And it certainly wasn't uniformly supported by all forest landowners.
Glenn?
Yeah, just one important point that I forgot to mention. We're still exploring it a little bit more to understand it, but we may not be able to allow this as a new use inside of urban and rural reserves. There may be existing rules that preclude us, at least in the Portland Metro, from allowing them. So to the extent that there's a timber zone parcel of 80 acres inside of one of the reserves, we may not be able to allow this as a new use. So there may be even less than 58.
So we have a couple more pieces here, but it sounds like we are gonna put a pause. It
Yeah.
sounds like, there's enough here that it's probably worth another study session to finish the last two and maybe revisit with some more information, the other things that we came up with, right?
Sounds good.
So if it makes sense to you all, we'll move to the mining 101, and then we'll try and get everyone out of here. We have to be out of the building by 10, and I'm hoping that we can.
Right.
We can,
On the
settle
final
up
two,
sooner
Glenn,
than that.
there were no
Yeah.
burning decisions that really should be made tonight or input? Okay,
No.
just was curious.
Thank you all for your
Yeah,
patience.
thank you, Glenn. This is
Thanks,
well
Glenn.
done.
Wow, you've been busy.
How much for minor
More
amendments?
than he bargained for tonight.
Very good job.
So while Martha's getting
have minutes?
ready,
Do you have minutes to approve already?
Mining.
we probably could do minutes too.
We
Let's,
can figure out what's next.
we're gonna jump to that while Martha's getting ready. Do we have the minutes in front of us?
I thought I saw that
Yes.
Darcy had distributed them.
They were here.
So it makes sense to go ahead and take care of that business now.
I
Does
just
that-
want to note that they say draft on them, and so is it that they stay as draft until we approve them, or they?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm trying to find my copy somewhere here. Thank you.
I approve.
Yes. Take time to look for it. Do you need to leave, Christine?
I'm just waiting patiently. We'll get through the minutes. Thank you.
Would anyone like to entertain a motion to approve the minutes?
Motion to approve the minutes from July 22nd, 2019.
Motion by Steve. Is there a second?
Second?
Second by Tammy. Heard you first. Any discussion, changes, amendments? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstentions?
Here, I wasn't here.
Yeah. Commissioner Wilson abstains. Otherwise, the motion passes. We're going to move to Martha. Martha, I was going to just start with some housekeeping stuff because we had talked earlier about the length of the presentation that's going to be given by the applicant at the next meeting. And I'm going to suggest, so they have up to, I think we suggested they would have 40, up to an hour, but try to get it done in 45 minutes is kind of what we
Yes.
had told them. Is that accurate?
45 minutes.
Yeah. And so the history here when we do this is we all start jumping in with a lot of questions, and 45 minutes becomes an hour and a half really quickly. And so I'm not going to stop anyone from asking an urgent question, but I think if we could make it a practice next week of writing down the questions and letting them get through their presentation, and we'll ask questions at the end, I think it will get us out of here faster. So I'll throw that out there as just something to think about. So with that,
Okay.
we'll be on
Hi.
the edge of our seats.
You all know that I talk really fast, so.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm Martha Fritzy, Senior Planner with the Planning Division. And a couple of really quick things. I see some of you have your really big binders with you, and I'm sorry that you lugged them here today. We are not talking about the specifics of the land use application. The hearing is next week, next Monday evening. And I will give a presentation specific to that application, and then we will have a regular public hearings process. That said, today the staff report and exhibits were posted online, and you received in front of you a copy of my 60-page staff report, but almost 6 of them are conditions of approval. As some of you are aware, this is a complicated topic. The reason I'm here today is to spend a little bit of time to hopefully prepare you for what you're going to read in the staff report and in the application, and discuss the 10-ish step process of decision-making for an application like you will be seeing next week, which is for a large aggregate mining facility. So I'm just going to jump right in. This isn't a super long presentation. Does everybody have a copy? Since you have a hard time seeing it. And what do I do? Just click it that way? Okay. So just for a little bit of background, we all know that there are statewide planning goals. Statewide Planning Goal 5 deals with protection of natural resources. Specific Goal 5 resources under the statewide planning structure can include things like riparian corridors, wildlife habitat, scenic rivers, groundwater resources, and it specifically includes mineral and aggregate resources. There's a recognition that not only do mineral and aggregate resources and the mining of those sometimes impact surrounding users, but if there is a significant resource that needs to be or should be mined, then they also get protection from surrounding users because they are an important resource. And so as part of the Goal 5 process, it's a somewhat complicated, labor-intensive process to identify which resources are significant and important enough to be allowed to continue or to be allowed to operate, but then also subsequently get the protection that Goal 5 offers them. And so generally the criterion decision-making process is very specific for Goal 5 and similarly specifically for aggregate resources in exclusive farm use zones. The administrative rules are very prescriptive. There's a number of rules. You need to go through a multi-step process, and for aggregate resources, generally what you do is look at whether or not the resource is significant. If you determine it's significant, and we'll talk a little bit about how you determine that, you then look at whether or not you are going to allow mining on that site by looking at potential impacts that mining that site would have on surrounding properties. It requires, if you determine that a site is significant, it requires a comprehensive plan amendment. You add it to the Goal 5 inventory of significant aggregate resources in the comprehensive plan, and you then apply a zone change. You apply a mineral and aggregate overlay to that property. There's a section in the zoning code, section 708, that talks about allowed uses in the mineral and aggregate overlay, and it also talks about uses in the overlay that may not be allowed on other properties because of the potential impacts to the mining operation. This is all done through a series of public hearings. The first one's next week with you all. You hold the public hearing, discuss
make a recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners, who ultimately will have another public hearing and make a final decision. We have held the January 13th hearing date for you if you should decide you need to continue the hearing that we're going to have next week. And this particular application that we're going to be talking about is going to the board in February. But I said I wasn't going to talk about it, so I'm not. First step in Goal 5, Mineral and Aggregate Resources. Very simple. We need to determine if the application is complete. State law tells us we have to do this, also tells us what we need to look at. There are those 5 listed things that you have to look for. There needs to be an analysis of the quality, quantity, and location of the resource. There needs to be a conceptual site reclamation plan, a traffic impact assessment, proposals to minimize any impacts that are identified, and a site plan that is fairly specific about operational characteristics and what uses are going to go on the site. Certain mining operations have things like processing on site, office buildings, parking. There's all sorts of things that could potentially go inside of your mineral aggregate overlay. State law also tells us we have 180 days to make the final decision.
Martha, can I ask a process management question? So in my history on this commission, we've dealt with this procedurally in a million different ways. Like when we go into deliberations of the commission, I've seen us chat about all of these steps together and make a decision in the end. I've seen us like go through straw polls at each stage here. And then at the extreme end, we've taken votes on every step, right? What do you think is the best way for us to get through that process and make sure we've crossed all our T's and dotted all our I's? Would you prefer like every step, like we take a vote on it?
So
Does that make more sense?
we did not plan this. This brings me to this other item in your packet. I created a matrix, and some of you who've gone through this process with me a couple of years ago are familiar with this. You don't have to use this matrix. It helps me think through the analysis and the steps that you need to take, and there's a couple sort of natural decision-making points identified in here. And so it might be helpful to stop at those points, talk about the analysis and what decision you want to make, because as you'll see, if you say yes, you move on. If you say no, you're done. I mean, at certain points. And so I think it makes sense to stop at those points, not necessarily every single step. And so I can walk through some of those really quickly because we've only gotten to one and I said I was going to talk fast. So the very first step is really step 2, determine if your site is significant. Your site is significant under state law in the Willamette Valley. If your experts do the analysis, do a reasonable analysis of sampling, and identify at least 2 million tons of aggregate material on your site. You also need to have the material tested to meet specific quality standards, and it needs to be an appropriate location. And that is a little vague under state law, admittedly. If you're going to have, 100 or a very large site, it's hard, I think, to be in an inappropriate location unless perhaps you're located maybe in the floodway of a river or something that's going to cause a whole lot of additional impacts. And so you look at all of the analysis of the experts and you determine if the site is significant. And this is your first decision-making point. Is the site significant based on the criteria that are outlined in administrative rule? If you decide it is significant, then you move on and decide whether or not you're going to allow mining. If you decide, no, there's not 2 million tons of aggregate, it's not significant, you're done. You can't allow mining on this site in EFU. There is, not up here, there is another standard if it is primarily, if the site has more than 35% class 1, 2 primary unique soils, there's also a minimum depth, a minimum average depth that you need to meet in order for it to be significant. So if you determine a site significant, the next step is to determine what the potential impact area is. State law says you have to look at 1,500 feet, but if there's some particular reason in your analysis that you find it needs to be larger, it can be larger. Within that 1,500 feet around the proposed site, you identify existing and approved uses. It talks specifically about sensitive uses, lists things like dwellings, schools, churches, things like that. And then you identify potential conflicts, specifically noise, dust, other discharges, conflicts to local roads, safety conflicts with public airports, other Goal 5 resources, and conflicts with agricultural practices. There is a lot of analysis that goes into this portion of it. There are a lot of consultants that get involved. You'll have a noise consultant modeling noise and looking at potential impacts for the houses. You'll have a hydrogeologist looking at the groundwater and potential effects to wells in the area. It's a pretty labor-intensive analysis. And you look at the conflicts. And what you're looking at is not necessarily that there are no conflicts, but if there are conflicts, can they be minimized? Are there measures that can be taken to minimize those conflicts? And specific things like berms to buffer noise, or specific equipment that you can use to decrease noise or dust. Watering haul roads on sites is common. You'll see talk about wet mining versus dewatering the mining site. You dewater the mining site, it creates more dust. It could potentially have more groundwater impacts. If you're mining in the wet, not pulling the water out of the site, keeps the dust down, potentially would have fewer groundwater impacts. There's a lot of things to consider. The important thing to understand is that minimizing a conflict, if there is some sort of local, state, or federal standard, for example, DEQ noise standard, if you can demonstrate you meet that standard, your conflict is minimized. You can meet it with a berm, with creating something on the site. There's a lot of different ways to minimize the conflicts, but that's the standard. This is just a little more specific. You need to look at also natural features, river, streams, and wetlands, dust, traffic, specifically impacts on agricultural operations. And if you determine all of your conflicts can be minimized, you can allow mining. If one or more conflicts cannot be minimized, it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't allow mining, but then you have to launch yourself into an easy analysis of the economic, social, energy, and environmental consequences in which you're balancing potential consequences of allowing mining versus potential consequences of not allowing mining because of the impacts. And so in my limited experience, this is my second big mining application, the applicants really try very hard to minimize all the conflicts on site with all these various methods in order to not have to get into this easy analysis, because it makes it a lot easier. And I guess in theory, it makes it a whole lot better for the uses around them too, because they're not being impacted as much. If you are doing the easy analysis, you look at the degree of adverse effects on existing land uses, reasonable practical measures to reduce those adverse effects, and you consider the duration of the mining operation, because obviously it's, once the resource is gone, it's gone, and then it's reclaimed into a different use. And so you consider the somewhat temporary nature of the mining application, balancing these. If you determine through this easy analysis that on balance you should allow the mining to go forward, then you allow the mining. If mining's not allowed, if you determine the impacts are still too great, then no further analysis is required, you're done. But it's important to note that the site can still be deemed a significant site and adopted into our comprehensive plan as a significant site. We actually have one of those in the county where it was just too impactful to actually allow mining, but the analysis showed there was, it met the standards to be a significant site, but it was not allowed to mine, so it can happen. The next step is to determine what the post-mining use is. Applicants are required to provide you with a reclamation plan. It needs to essentially identify what the future use is going to be when they're done mining. And for our purposes at the county, we are largely looking at whether or not the use is allowed under the zoning. and there's no big real red flags. Ultimately, reclamation is administered through permitting by DOGAMI, the Department of Geology and Mineral Industries. We don't have a huge role here at the county level in the reclamation plan, but it does need to be there, and it does need to be an allowed use. And so because these are on EFU land, the uses that we're seeing in reclamation plans are largely ponds and lakes and natural areas, and it's certainly nothing real significant, and I would quite frankly think it would be hard to farm the property after something like this. I'm not quite sure how you would do that. So then finally, you need to identify future conflicting uses, and this is where we get to the part of protecting the Goal 5 resource. So you've identified you have a significant resource. You've identified that all of the impacts can be mitigated or managed so that it's reasonable to allow the mining. And then you need to identify future off-site conflicting uses in the impact area. Now, in some cases, the impact area, if all of your impacts are minimized, the overlay area is just the site that's being mined, and so it's pretty easy because you're only allowing mining in that site and whatever the reclamation is. If for some reason the overlay area where there's potential conflicts is larger than your site, you need to look at new uses that are allowed in the underlying zoning district and whether or not it's reasonable to restrict those moving forward in order to protect your Goal 5, your mining resource. And so in order to do that, you complete an easy analysis. And so based on the analysis, you need to decide whether or not to allow conflicting uses within the overlay boundary, to limit the conflicting uses, or to prohibit the conflicting uses. And then finally, once you're all done with that, you get to amend the comprehensive plan to carry out your decision. We add the site to the Goal 5 inventory of significant sites that's listed in the comprehensive plan, and create implementing measures and conditions for the mining. They need to be clear and objective. It's really important to note that after those 10 steps, you have a significant site identified in the plan, and you have identified that you should allow mining. Mining cannot actually commence until the Mineral and Aggregate Overlay District Site Plan Review application is approved. That's basically 3 applications. In some cases, the first 2 come in, and they just want to know that the mining is allowed. They haven't put together their site plan yet. They're not ready to start implementing, and that will come in later. The last few that I've seen, all 3 applications come in. And so the district site plan review is essentially a review of the mining plan against the standards that are found in section 708 of our zoning and development ordinance. And there are criteria in there that talk about screening and hours of operation and noise and traffic and blasting and again, reclamation plans and all sorts of other issues. So once that last piece is approved, then mining can commence, subject to meeting what will most likely be a long list of conditions on that property. And that's it. These hearings can at times become contentious, as you can probably understand. Sometimes this is a very concerning topic to neighbors. So essentially, you're going to see your application materials, which you have a very large binder, staff report, findings and recommendations, and the complete record, all exhibits that have come in. What you may hear at the hearing is conflicting expert testimony. I'm a planner, I'm staff. I can read and understand whether or not I think reasonable conclusions have been reached based on the information put in front of me, but I am not an expert. I'm not a hydrogeologist. I'm not an engineer. To some extent, if you have to rely on the experts and the information that they provide you, but sometimes, as in other applications, you may have an opponent with a different expert saying something different. And that's where you as decision makers have to weigh in and try to decide which information is the most reasonable or believable, I suppose, for lack of a better word. And that's it.
As I
That was my-
understand it, there is already an existing mining operation there. This is just a next phase of this. Is that correct?
So I'm not talking about the application you're going to see next week. All of the information is in the staff report and in the binder. I can't talk
Yeah,
about
it's
it.
just,
There's-
because
Neither
it's,
do we,
it's potentially
right.
ex parte contact. So that's the reason we're trying to be really careful that the specifics will come next week, when all the parties are here.
I'm happy to answer process questions.
Okay.
So let's talk about process for a second, right? Just so, I think if we talk about it a little bit now, it'll streamline our hearing next week. So I think everyone knows what's going to happen, right, is we're going to get a staff report, we'll get a presentation from the application, we'll take public testimony, and then ultimately, when that's finished, we'll move into deliberations, right? And I'm going to propose that we walk through these 6 decisions that Martha has laid out. So I think, we'll literally start with, number 1, is it significant? And I think we work best when we we'll start with that. We'll do a quick kind of straw poll just to for everyone to say, this is where I'm at. And hopefully that will give someone, we'll know if we have a consensus or not. We can make a motion and vote it up and down, and we'll just move through those 6 questions.
And what's nice is you're not jumping from topic to topic. You're
Yeah.
on this topic, you discuss that, you get the input, and then you go to the next. Because
Right.
that's in the past where we had a lot of issues
Yeah.
with berries and horses and.
And it takes us
Oh,
like
it
3
took-
meetings to do what we
Oh,
could have done
it's
in one,
awful.
right?
So if we can stay on topic, and if somebody asks the questions on the next one, we just note it and
Note
pick it up
and
later.
move on,
Yep.
right.
Yep.
Does that make sense? So we'll walk through those 6, we'll have 6 motions, and then by the end, we'll have a decision.
Yeah, I think the one I remember we had so much trouble, one, there was some issues,
Right.
Yep.
but the process wasn't clear as to how we worked through it.
Right.
And it wasn't, I don't think we had this little
Spreadsheet.
spreadsheet initially.
Yeah,
So we were like
This is
all
gonna be a
over the
great
place.
tool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I'm
I
a
think
very linear thinker, and this
Yeah.
helps me.
No,
put
this
things-
just makes
And
sense.
I think that's the easiest way for us to move through the process. So we've got
Yep.
a step-by-step, we answer 6 questions, and that's our job next week, is to
Right.
answer those 6 questions.
And I really like the idea. I have a gob of questions, but I think it's a great idea that we just wait to the end and then give it. Now, do we ask questions after the applicant but before the testimonies?
You can
Okay.
you can ask
Okay, I
questions
think
of the
so.
applicant.
We'll definitely, and it may or may, the applicant is probably going to have like 5 or 6 people testify. So it's not going to be one applicant, right?
Right.
So it may make sense for us to stop after each person. But I think the big thing is let's let those individuals get through their presentation, and then we'll ask questions. And I think that will speed things up a lot.
I do too. And it really gives them consistency. Let us get through it, because otherwise, man, we've jumped like crazy around. Yeah.
And
Cool.
we feed off each other, as
Yeah, I
we
know.
noted last night, right? We will, myself included, we'll talk all night long. So the more
Right.
we can focus the conversation, the better.
Great.
Does the county have anybody else involved in this as far as a geologist or anything of that? No. So it's just our expertise up here.
They're professionals, yeah. That's why we got to read all those fun reports. My favorite, of course, was traffic. Woohoo!
Do anything on a schedule review, Jennifer?
We do have a traffic engineer at the county, so that part
Okay.
can be vetted,
That-
but
that-
not
okay.
the other scientists, we don't
We don't
have.
have, nobody from DLCD or, okay.
Anything with regard to a schedule review? We're going to see each other next week.
So I think we need to see what happens next week. If you're actually, we have a different plan for January, most likely, depending upon whether you finish mining next week or need to set it over to the 13th. So we'll just kind of wait and see what happens next week.
I know we can't talk about the application, but do we have a sense of how controversial it is and how many people we might have in the audience?
Nope.
Have you heard anything?
All of the exhibits are posted online. They're not in your packet. I can tell you that all of the exhibits at this time have been put into the record by staff.
Okay,
They're not testimony.
okay.
No.
Excellent. So that's actually good news. So I think I think it would be great to get this all done in one fell swoop. But
We
we'll have
could
to
do
see
it,
how
right,
long-
well
yeah.
managed. I think we could do it, yeah.
Didn't we get a copy of it?
That's
I
an
mean,
exhibit
I
list. Is
assume
that
if
what-
it
You do have a
is
copy of it.
between
I'm sorry, I
staying
didn't know
an
we
extra
printed it.
45 minutes or
It's so
coming back
organized.
another week, people would rather
all
stay
the
another
comments.
45
Tom has a
minutes.
copy of it. I don't know if
Especially
anyone
if
else
we
does.
have citizens,
Oh,
it's
okay,
so
yeah.
much better to do it
Looks
at
like
the
you
same
do have the
time.
exhibits.
You do have a
Darcy
copy
is
of it.
on top of it as usual, so.
Cool.
So we're
All
gonna
right,
try and get this
Martha.
done.
But we will see you next week.
Okay,
Thank you.
cool.
Great.
Now, want to see you rate.